My dad spotted me, limping along the blistering highway shoulder with my baby crying heavily on my hip. He slammed on the brakes of his old truck, jumped out, and demanded to know why I was walking in the unbearable heat. I looked at him with tears streaming down my face and told him that my husband's mother took my car. I told him she said I was lucky they even let me stay in their house and that I needed to be grounded to learn my place. My dad did not yell or lose his temper. He just looked at my bleeding feet, opened the passenger door and said with a terrifyingly calm voice to get in the car because we are fixing this tonight. Before I share exactly how we destroyed her empire and took back my life, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe toxic in-laws always get what they deserve. I am Lauren, 33 years old, and until that sweltering July afternoon, I thought playing the obedient wife would eventually earn me a place in my husband's family. I thought that if I kept my head down, smiled at the right times, and swallowed my pride, I could keep the peace. I was wrong. The air in our upscale Atlanta suburb was thick with humidity, pressing down on me like a physical weight as I dragged my feet along the burning asphalt. The midday sun was unforgiving, beating down on my shoulders and radiating off the pavement in shimmering waves of pure heat. Every step sent a sharp, stinging pain up my legs. I was wearing slight wedges shoes, meant for a quick trip to the grocery store or a casual lunch, not for a 3-mile trek along a busy suburban road with no sidewalks. My son Leo, who had just turned 14 months old, was sobbing against my chest. His small body was radiating heat, his face flushed and damp with sweat. I kept shifting his weight from one hip to the other, trying to find a comfortable position while murmuring soft, useless apologies into his hair. My arms were trembling from exhaustion. I had no stroller, no diaper bag, and no water. I had nothing but the clothes on my back and the crushing realization that my marriage was nothing more than a trap. Cars sped past us, the rush of hot wind hitting my face and blowing my loose hair into my eyes, but nobody stopped. In this neighborhood of sprawling mansions and perfectly manicured lawns, a woman walking on the side of the road was an anomaly to be ignored. The physical pain of the blisters forming on my heels was nothing compared to the agony in my chest. Just an hour earlier, my entire reality had been ripped away by the two people who were supposed to be my family. I replayed the confrontation in my mind with every agonizing step. My mother-in-law, Patricia, had barged into our home unannounced. At 62 years old, Patricia was a ruthless real estate mogul who ruled her boutique firm and her family with an iron fist. She viewed me as a peasant who had somehow infiltrated her pristine bloodline. She marched into my kitchen, her designer heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor, and demanded the keys to my SUV. When I asked her why, Patricia laughed, a cold, mocking sound that chilled me to the bone. She told me the vehicle was technically owned by her real estate LLC, which was true. When Greg and I got married, Patricia insisted on providing my car as a company lease to save us money. I had thought it was a generous wedding gift. Instead, it was a leash. She stood in my kitchen and called me a freeloader who contributed absolutely nothing to the household. She looked me up and down with utter disgust and announced that she was revoking my car privileges. She said I needed to be grounded to learn some respect for the family hierarchy. But Patricia's cruelty was not what broke me. What broke me was Greg, my 35-year-old husband. The man who had promised to protect and cherish me stood entirely silent by the kitchen island. He watched his mother humiliate me in my own home. When I turned to him, begging him to intervene, begging him to explain that I needed the car to take Leo to his pediatrician appointment, Greg just stared at his expensive loafers. He muttered that I was acting crazy and embarrassing him. He told me to just give her the keys and stop causing a scene. Over the past 2 years, Greg had systematically pressured me to leave my job when I got pregnant, claiming he wanted me to have a stress-free life. Then he slowly started cutting off my access to our joint bank accounts, transferring funds, and questioning every single grocery receipt. He had isolated me, stripped me of my financial power, and left me completely dependent. Taking the car was just the final turn of the screw. I had handed over the keys, picked up my baby, and walked out the front door without another word. I could not stay in that house for one more second. I just started walking, blinded by tears and suffocating under the weight of my own foolishness for letting them render me so helpless. I stumbled slightly as a sharp rock pierced the thin sole of my sandal. A sob tore from my throat, raw and loud, drowning out the sound of the traffic for a brief moment. I pulled Leo closer, burying my face in his damp neck, whispering that Mommy was so sorry, that Mommy would fix this. Suddenly, the unmistakable roar of an old, heavy engine cut through the suburban quiet. A beat-up, faded blue Ford pickup truck swerved aggressively onto the shoulder, kicking up a cloud of dry dust and gravel right in front of me. I froze, my heart pounding in my throat, pulling Leo back defensively. Then the driver's side door creaked open, and a tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out into the blazing sun. It was my father, William. At 60 years old, he was a pragmatic, blue-collar man who preferred faded flannel shirts and worn work boots to designer suits. Patricia and Greg constantly sneered at him, viewing him as uneducated, working-class trash. They had no idea that my father had built a massive, multi-state logistics and supply chain empire from a single delivery truck. He possessed immense, quiet wealth, but he never flaunted it, choosing to live humbly and comfortably. My dad took one look at me standing there in the dirt. He saw the red, angry blisters bleeding through the straps of my shoes. He saw his grandson screaming from the heat. He saw the absolute devastation written across my face. His jaw tightened so hard, I thought his teeth might crack. He did not ask what I was doing or where I was going. He walked straight toward me, his heavy boots crunching on the gravel, and gently took Leo from my shaking arms. "Why are you walking Lauren?" he asked, his voice low and rumbling with a protective fury I had not heard since I was a little girl. "Where is your car?" The dam finally broke. I leaned against the side of his dusty truck and sobbed. I told him everything. I told him how Patricia showed up out of nowhere and demanded the keys. I repeated her exact venomous words. How she called me a freeloader. How she said I was lucky they even let me stay in the house. How she was grounding me like a disobedient child. I sobbed as I confessed how Greg just stood there and let it happen. How he called me crazy and took her side. The shame of admitting how completely I had been subjugated burned my throat, but I could not stop the words from pouring out. My dad settled Leo securely against his broad chest, rocking him gently until the baby's cries softened into exhausted hiccups. He did not lecture me. He did not ask why I had not called him sooner, or why I had let things get this bad. He looked past me, his eyes fixing on the direction of the gated community where my husband and mother-in-law were currently sitting comfortably in the air conditioning. The silence that stretched between us was heavy charged with an electric tension that made the sweltering air feel even thicker. When my father finally spoke, his voice was completely devoid of its usual warmth. It was cold, sharp, and terrifyingly calm. "Get in the car," he said, opening the passenger door for me. "We are fixing this tonight." I climbed into the cab of the truck, the worn vinyl seat burning the backs of my thighs, before the ancient air conditioning blasted me with freezing, glorious relief. My father secured Leo into the car seat I always kept strapped in the back for emergencies, his large, calloused hands moving with surprising gentleness. Once the baby was safe and already nodding off from the cool air and the exhaustion of his own crying, my dad slid behind the wheel. He did not say another word. He just threw the truck into drive, the transmission grinding slightly, and wrenched the steering wheel hard to the left. The heavy tires spun against the gravel, kicking up a thick cloud of dust as he pulled a sharp U-turn right in the middle of the empty suburban road. We were heading back the exact way I had just come. We were heading straight for Patricia's estate. I sat clutching my purse, my heart hammering against my ribs so violently I thought it might shatter my breastbone. "Dad, wait," I said, my voice trembling. "What are you going to do? Greg is going to be furious. He hates it when we cause a scene in front of his mother." My father kept his eyes fixed firmly on the road ahead. "Let him be furious," he replied, his tone laced with a coldness that made the hair on my arms stand up. "I have watched that boy chip away at you for 2 years, Lauren. I have held my tongue because you asked me to. You said you had it under control. But leaving my daughter and my grandson to walk on the side of a highway in 100-degree heat is where my patience ends." I shrank back against the seat. I felt the familiar, suffocating wave of guilt and shame washing over me. I tried to defend my husband, mostly out of habit. Greg said, "Money has just been tight lately," I murmured, staring down at my raw, blistered feet. He said Patricia needed the car for her leasing agents, and that since I do not bring in a paycheck anymore, I do not really need my own vehicle. I can just use his when he gets home from the office. My father let out a harsh, humorless laugh. He gripped the steering wheel so tightly, his knuckles turned white. "Money is tight," he repeated mockingly. "The man wears $2,000 suits and just bought a country club membership. He does not have a money problem, Lauren. He has a control problem." I closed my eyes, the truth of my father's words hitting me like a physical blow. It had not happened all at once. It had been a slow, insidious fade, a creeping isolation that I had not fully recognized until the trap was completely shut. When I first got pregnant with Leo, I was working long hours at a corporate accounting firm. I was exhausted, dealing with severe morning sickness, and Greg had swooped in, playing the role of the devoted, protective husband. He sat me down one evening, rubbing my shoulders, and told me that the stress was not good for the baby. He insisted his commercial real estate deals were about to pay off massively, and that his mother's firm was booming. He told me I should quit my boring office job, relax, and focus entirely on building our family. I had believed him. I had trusted the man I married. I handed in my resignation, thinking I was stepping into a beautiful new chapter of motherhood. But the moment my independent income stopped, the dynamic of our marriage completely shifted. First, Greg suggested we restructure our finances to better manage our new single-income household. He moved his direct deposits into a separate account, giving me an allowance card for groceries and baby supplies. Whenever I asked to see the bank statements, he would deflect, claiming the numbers would just stress me out and that he had everything handled. By the time Leo was born, I had to ask for permission to buy a coffee. My father glanced over at me, his sharp eyes catching the tears silently trailing down my cheeks. "He isolated you, Lauren," he said softly, the anger in his voice shifting into a deep, protective sorrow. "He convinced you to drop your career, separated you from your coworkers, and made you entirely dependent on him and that wicked mother of his." Financial abuse does not always look like empty bank accounts. Sometimes it looks exactly like what Greg did. He made sure you had no safety net, so you could never leave. I swallowed the thick lump in my throat. "I am so stupid," I whispered. "I let them do this to me. I let her take my car. I let him stand there and treat me like a child. I do not have anything of my own anymore, Dad. My name is not on the house. It is not on the bank accounts. It is not even on the car I drove my baby around in. I have absolutely nothing." The truck engine roared as my father pressed his foot harder onto the accelerator. We passed the familiar upscale shopping plazas and manicured country club entrances that marked the approach to Patricia's neighborhood. "You listen to me right now, Lauren," my dad said, his voice cutting through the thick, air-conditioned silence of the cab. "You are not stupid. You are a mother who trusted her husband to protect her family. That is not a character flaw. That is what you are supposed to do in a marriage. The flaw belongs entirely to them for exploiting that trust." I looked over at him, seeking whatever strength he was offering. "And you are wrong about having nothing," he continued, his tone turning fiercely adamant. "You have me. You have a father who will tear down this entire city block by block before he lets anyone treat you like a stray dog. And more importantly, you have yourself. You are one of the smartest women I know. You passed your certified public accountant exams with flying colors. You understand money better than those two silver spoon frauds ever will. Do not let Patricia convince you that you are powerless just because you are not currently sitting in a corner office. Power is not just about who holds the deed to a house. It is about who knows how to fight back." His words sparked a tiny, dormant ember deep inside my chest. For the last 2 years, Greg and Patricia had treated me like a naive housewife who could barely balance a checkbook. They had grown so accustomed to my silence and my compliance that they had completely forgotten who I was before I married into their family. They had forgotten that I spent years untangling complex financial webs for major corporations. They thought I was trapped because they held the purse strings. They had no idea what I was actually capable of doing when backed into a corner. The massive wrought iron gates of the exclusive Oak Creek estate loomed ahead of us like a fortress. My father did not even slow down as we approached. He kept his eyes locked on the intimidating brick entrance. "Are you ready for this?" he asked. I wiped away the last of my tears, feeling a new, cold, hard resolve settling in my stomach. "I am ready," I said. My father did not slow down as we approached the massive stone columns flanking the entrance to Oak Creek Estate. The neighborhood security guard was a stickler for the rules, requiring residents to authorize every single visitor before the barrier would lift. I watched a pristine white delivery van idle at the call box just ahead of us. The driver reached out his window to scan a barcode on the terminal. The heavy iron gates began their slow swing inward. Instead of pulling up to the call box and waiting for the guard to notice us, my dad accelerated. He rode the bumper of the delivery van so closely that I could read the fine print on the license plate frame. We slipped through the entrance a fraction of a second before the iron gates clamped shut behind us. The security guard stepped out of his booth, waving his arms and shouting, but my father simply kept his eyes on the road. He navigated the winding, tree-lined streets with practiced precision. The houses here were like fortresses, set far back from the road, behind immaculate hedges and sweeping circular driveways. The air conditioning in the cab hummed loudly, but I still felt a cold sweat breaking out on my neck. Leo was sound asleep in his car seat, oblivious to the impending collision of our two families. A part of me still wanted to beg my dad to turn the truck around, to go back to my house and accept my punishment like a compliant wife. I had spent 2 years learning to shrink myself down to avoid setting off Patricia or annoying Greg. Standing up to them felt like stepping off a cliff. But then I looked down at my feet. The raw blisters covering my heels throbbed with a dull ache. I remembered the casual cruelty in Patricia's eyes when she demanded my keys. I remembered the cowardly silence from Greg. My father was right. They had intentionally tried to break me, and running away would only prove to them that their tactics worked. I took a deep, shaky breath, forcing myself to sit up straighter in the passenger seat. We pulled onto Patricia Street, a quiet cul-de-sac dominated by her sprawling Mediterranean-style mansion. The landscaping was perfectly symmetrical, with imported palm trees standing at attention. My father did not park on the street. He drove his battered, dust-covered Ford pickup right onto her pristine, hand-laid paver driveway. The truck looked completely alien against the backdrop of European luxury vehicles that usually occupied this space. The engine sputtered and died as my dad turned the key, plunging the cab into a heavy, expectant silence. He turned to me, his expression resolute and calm. He told me to stay behind him and let him do the talking. I nodded, unbuckling my seatbelt with trembling hands. I reached into the back seat to carefully unstrap Leo, pulling my sleeping son against my chest. His small, warm weight grounded me, reminding me exactly why I needed to fight back. I was not just protecting myself anymore. I had to protect him from growing up thinking this kind of abuse was normal. My dad stepped out of the truck, his heavy work boots hitting the pavers with a solid thud. He did not bother walking to the massive arched front door. He knew exactly where Patricia would be at this time of day. We walked around the side of the massive house, passing the manicured rose bushes and the bubbling stone fountains. The afternoon sun beat down on us, heavy and oppressive, but I barely felt the heat. All my senses were hyper-focused on the sounds of laughter drifting from the backyard. We rounded the corner of the house and stepped onto the expansive outdoor living area. The patio was paved in imported travertine tile and shaded by a custom pergola draped with blooming vines. Beyond the patio, the turquoise water of a massive infinity pool sparkled in the late afternoon sun. Greg and Patricia were sitting at a high-top wrought iron table, the picture of relaxed, affluent celebration. They each held a chilled martini glass, the condensation glistening in the heat. A silver ice bucket, holding an expensive bottle of vodka, sat between them. They were laughing about something, their faces flushed with the easy joy of people who believed they were entirely untouchable. They were celebrating Greg's upcoming commercial real estate deal, a project he had been bragging about for months. The sharp crunch of my father's boots on the travertine tile shattered their private party. Patricia's laughter died instantly. Her perfectly arched eyebrows snapped together as she took in the sight of my father, his faded flannel shirt and dusty jeans standing in stark contrast to her designer silk blouse. She did not look at me or her sleeping grandson. Her eyes locked onto my dad's boots, her mouth twisting into a sneer of pure disdain. She set her martini glass down on the table with a sharp clink. She demanded to know what he thought he was doing, tracking dirt onto her imported stone. She asked if he had lost his mind, barging onto her private property like a common trespasser. Greg jumped up from his chair, almost knocking over his drink. His face turned a deep shade of crimson. He looked completely panicked, his eyes darting from me to my father and back to his mother, trying to gauge how angry she was. He opened his mouth to speak, likely to scold me for bringing my father into this, but my dad did not give him the chance. William stepped right up to the wrought iron table, his sheer physical presence dwarfing both Greg and Patricia. He did not raise his voice. He did not yell or gesture wildly. He spoke with a quiet, lethal authority that commanded the entire space. He told Patricia to hand over the keys to the SUV immediately. He stated that his daughter needed to take her baby home, and that this petty, vindictive game was over. Greg took a rapid step back, his trembling hands raised defensively in the air. He stammered, telling my dad to calm down and that he was overreacting. He tried to explain that the car was company property and that Patricia had every right to manage her business assets. He sounded exactly like a frightened child, reciting a script his mother had forced him to memorize. He refused to look me in the eye. He just kept repeating that I was making a huge mistake by escalating the situation and embarrassing him in front of his mother. Patricia simply sat back in her wrought iron chair and crossed her legs. A slow, cruel smile spread across her face. She looked at my father as if he were a particularly amusing insect that had wandered onto her patio. Then she threw her head back and laughed. It was a loud, theatrical sound that echoed across the infinity pool. She reached into her designer handbag, pulled out the key fob to my SUV, and dangled it from her manicured finger. She looked my father dead in the eye and told him she owed him absolutely nothing. She shifted her cold gaze to me. She pointed her perfectly manicured finger directly at me and announced in a very clear voice that she certainly owed absolutely nothing to a worthless, ungrateful freeloader. The word freeloader hung in the humid air like a physical strike. I felt my breath hitch in my throat. I pulled Leo a little tighter against my chest, shielding his sleeping face from the venom in her voice. I did not look at my father. I could feel the heat radiating from him, the protective fury coiling in his muscles, ready to unleash itself. Instead, I forced myself to look directly at Greg. This was the man who had stood at an altar and vowed to cherish me. This was the man who had held my hand in the delivery room when our son took his very first breath. Surely hearing his mother call his wife such a vile name in front of his child would be the breaking point. Surely this was the moment he would finally step forward, take the keys from her manicured hand, and tell her that she had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. I stared at his face, searching his features for any sign of a spine, any flicker of the protective husband he used to pretend to be. "Greg," I whispered, my voice thick with unshed tears. "Are you really going to stand there and let her speak to me like this? Are you really going to let her leave your son stranded on the side of a highway? Tell her to give the keys back. Tell her this is wrong." Greg shifted his weight nervously from one foot to the other. His eyes darted toward the high hedges that separated Patricia's estate from the neighboring mansions. He was not looking at my blistered feet. He was not looking at the sweat dampening his infant son's hair. He was worried that someone next door might be listening to us ruin his perfect afternoon. Slowly, deliberately, Greg took a step backward until he was positioned slightly behind his mother's wrought iron chair. He crossed his arms over his chest, puffing himself up in a pathetic attempt to look authoritative. "Lauren, you need to calm down," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "You are acting completely crazy right now. You are acting hysterical, and you are embarrassing me in front of the entire neighborhood. You had absolutely no right to drag your father over here and ambush us while we were trying to celebrate a major business milestone." The betrayal was a cold knife twisting in my stomach. He was prioritizing a real estate deal over his own family. "You are embarrassed?" I asked, my voice rising just a fraction despite my best efforts to keep it steady. "Your mother stole the car that has my baby's car seat in it. She left us to walk miles in this heat, and you think I am the one embarrassing you?" Greg sighed loudly, rolling his eyes, as if I were a toddler throwing a tantrum over a toy. "The car belongs to the firm, Lauren," he stated flatly, parroting his mother's exact corporate talking points. "My mother pays the insurance. She pays the maintenance. It is a business asset. You do not even have a job right now, so you do not actually need a dedicated vehicle during the day. If you need to run errands or go to the grocery store, you can just wait until I get home from the office. You need to learn how to be a team player and respect how this family operates. I fully support her decision. You need to be grounded until you can learn to appreciate everything we provide for you." I stared at him in utter disbelief. The illusion of my marriage shattered completely in that instant, falling into a million jagged pieces on the travertine tile. He was never going to protect me. He was perfectly content to keep me trapped as a dependent pet he could control and restrict whenever he saw fit. Before I could respond to his ridiculous demands, my father stepped forward. The heavy thud of his boots made Greg flinch visibly. William did not yell. He did not raise his hands. He simply looked at Greg with an expression of such profound, unadulterated disgust that it made the stifling summer air feel freezing cold. "You are a pathetic excuse for a man," my dad said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that carried across the patio. "I let you marry my daughter because you looked me in the eye and swore you would take care of her. But you are nothing but a coward. You hide behind your mother's skirt because you do not have the guts to stand on your own 2 feet. You cannot even protect your own wife and child from her petty bullying. You are not a husband. You are just a spoiled little boy playing dress-up in an expensive suit." Greg's face turned a violent shade of purple. He opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out. He just stood there, emasculated and humiliated by the undeniable truth of my father's words. Patricia, however, did not take kindly to anyone insulting her golden child. The smug smile vanished from her face instantly. She slammed her hand down on the table, making the ice bucket rattle against the metal frame. She pushed her chair back and stood up, smoothing the front of her designer blouse. She glared at my father with absolute venom. "How dare you come onto my property and insult my son?" she hissed, her voice vibrating with rage. "You are nothing but a dirty, blue-collared truck driver. You have no class, no manners, and no right to speak to us like that." She then turned her furious gaze onto me. "You want to play hardball, Lauren?" she challenged, her eyes narrowing into dangerous slits. "You want to bring your father here to threaten us over a simple company vehicle? Fine. We can play by those rules. Let me remind you of a very important fact that you seem to have conveniently forgotten. That beautiful 4-bedroom house you live in, the one where you sit around all day, contributing absolutely nothing, that house does not belong to Greg. It certainly does not belong to you. It is owned by Oak Creek Holdings, which is my firm. You are nothing but a tenant living there by my good graces." I gripped Leo tighter, a sudden wave of panic washing over me as I realized exactly where she was going with this. "And my good graces have just officially run out," Patricia announced, her voice echoing off the stone walls of her mansion. "I want you out. I am giving you exactly 24 hours to pack up your cheap clothes and whatever plastic toys you bought for that baby. You have until tomorrow afternoon to vacate my property. If you are not gone by the time Greg gets off work, I will personally call the police and have you removed for trespassing. You are evicted, Lauren." I felt the blood drain from my face. I looked at Greg again, desperate for him to stop his mother from rendering his own child homeless. But Greg just stared straight ahead, a smug, satisfied smirk creeping onto his face. He liked this. He liked watching me get crushed into submission. Patricia saw the terror flashing in my eyes, and she absolutely reveled in it. She took a slow, deliberate step toward me, crossing her arms over her chest. "Where exactly do you think you are going to go?" she taunted. "You have zero income. You have zero assets. If you try to fight a custody battle for Leo, you will completely fail. I will crush you, Lauren. You will walk away from this family with absolutely nothing today." The silence that followed Patricia's threat was absolute. I expected my father to erupt. I expected him to shout, to curse, to tear the wrought iron table from the patio and hurl it into the pristine blue water of the infinity pool. I braced myself for the explosion. But it never came. Instead, my father did something far more terrifying. He smiled. It was a cold, knowing smile that did not reach his eyes. It was the smile of a man who had spent his entire life outsmarting people who thought they were better than him. He looked at Patricia with a strange mixture of pity and absolute certainty, as if he were looking at a ghost. He did not say a single word in response to her eviction notice. He simply reached out and gently placed his large, calloused hand on the small of my back. He guided me away from the table, breaking the standoff. He reached down and picked up the canvas diaper bag I had dropped onto the travertine tile when we first arrived. He slung it over his broad shoulder, his other arm remaining firmly and protectively around me. He told me softly that it was time to go home. We turned our backs on them. We turned our backs on the lavish estate, the expensive cocktails, and the hollow shell of my marriage. We began walking back toward the front of the house, my father matching his long strides to my painful, limping pace. Our silence seemed to infuriate Patricia more than any argument ever could. She could not stand being ignored. She could not stand losing her audience. As we walked away, her voice chased us across the manicured lawn, growing shriller and more frantic with every step we took. She shouted that I was a coward for running away. She screamed that she would make sure I never saw a single penny of Greg's money. She laughed a harsh and grating sound, mocking my ruined shoes and my father's dusty truck. She yelled that I better start looking for a homeless shelter because no decent lawyer would ever take a case for a woman with a $0 bank balance. She taunted me, insisting that I was completely powerless and that she would tie me up in family court until I had nothing left to fight with. I kept my eyes fixed straight ahead. The heat radiating from the pavement was stifling, but I felt strangely detached from it. Greg did not call out to me. He did not chase after us to stop me from leaving with his son. He stayed exactly where he was, safely hidden in the shadow of his mother's wealth. We reached the truck. My father opened the passenger door, helping me climb inside before carefully ensuring Leo was still perfectly secure in his car seat. My dad walked around the front of the hood, his boots crunching against the pavers for the last time, and climbed into the driver's seat. He slammed the heavy metal door shut, instantly cutting off the sound of Patricia's shrill voice. The sudden quiet inside the cab was deafening. He started the engine, shifted the truck into reverse, and backed out of the driveway without a single backward glance. As we navigated through the winding streets of the gated community, the adrenaline that had been keeping me upright suddenly vanished. The reality of my situation crashed down upon me with the weight of a collapsing building. I was homeless. My marriage was over. I had a 14-month-old baby sleeping in the back seat, and my mother-in-law was planning to obliterate me in court. The tears returned, hot and fast, streaming down my cheeks and dripping off my chin. I pressed the heels of my hands against my eyes, trying to stifle the ragged sobs tearing at my throat. I felt so incredibly foolish. I had given up my career, my independence, and my financial security for a man who did not even have the courage to hand me a set of car keys. My father did not offer empty platitudes. He did not tell me everything was going to be all right, or that things would magically work out. He just drove, his strong hands gripping the steering wheel, giving me the space to grieve the life I had just lost. The air conditioning hummed steadily, cooling the sweat on my skin. We passed through the heavy iron gates of Oak Creek Estate, leaving the manicured lawns and the suffocating judgment behind us. I sat in the passenger seat and let myself cry for exactly 3 miles. I cried for the betrayal. I cried for the fear of the unknown. I cried for the woman I used to be, before I let Greg and Patricia make me feel so small. But as we merged onto the main highway, heading back toward my father's comfortable, quiet house in the neighboring county, something inside me shifted. The tears began to slow. The suffocating panic in my chest started to recede, replaced by a strange, tingling sensation. It was not hope. It was something sharper. It was clarity. I wiped my face with the back of my hand, smearing my tears, and taking a deep, shuddering breath. I reached down to the floorboard where my father had placed the diaper bag. I unzipped the main compartment and pushed aside the baby wipes and the spare onesies. My fingers brushed against the sleek, cool metal casing of my laptop, which I always kept tucked in the back pocket of the bag out of sheer habit. I pulled the computer out and rested it on my lap. I flipped the screen open. The sudden glow of the display illuminated the dim interior of the truck cab. My dad glanced over at me, his brow furrowing in slight confusion. "What are you doing, Lauren?" he asked quietly, his eyes flicking back to the road. You do not need to figure out your whole life right this second. You and Leo are coming home with me. You can stay as long as you need. We will get you a good lawyer tomorrow. We will figure the money out. You do not need to stress about that today. I stared at the login screen of my laptop. The background image was a picture of Leo smiling, a stark reminder of exactly who I was fighting for. My breathing slowed, evening out as the fog of panic completely lifted from my mind. I typed in my password, the familiar clicking sound of the keys bringing me a deep, anchoring sense of comfort. This machine was my domain. This was where I was powerful. She is right about one thing, Dad, I said, my voice completely stripped of its previous tremor. It sounded shockingly calm, ringing with a cold, metallic certainty that made my father look over at me again. I do not have a salary. I do not have a regular paycheck coming in right now. She thinks that makes me weak. She thinks that because I am a stay-at-home mom, I am completely blind to how the world works. I opened my encrypted password manager, scrolling past dozens of saved credentials, until I found the specific folder I was looking for. The folder was labeled Oak Creek Holdings. But Patricia is arrogant. I continued, my fingers hovering over the trackpad. And arrogant people are usually very sloppy. When tax season came around last year, she did not want to pay her expensive corporate accountants their premium hourly rate to handle the internal auditing. She complained that it was a waste of money. Greg volunteered me to do it for free. He told her I used to be a certified public accountant and that I had plenty of free time while the baby was napping. She treated me like an unpaid intern, throwing boxes of receipts and digital files at me, demanding I sort out her chaotic ledgers to save her a few $1,000s. I clicked on the folder, accessing the secure credentials stored inside. She set me up with a master administrative login to her firm's entire central accounting server, so I could access the necessary files. I explained, my eyes tracking the datapaths on the screen. She is technologically illiterate, Dad. She relies on her IT guy for everything, but she fired him 3 months ago to cut costs and never replaced him. She has absolutely no idea how digital security works, and because she thinks I am just a useless, dependent housewife who knows nothing about real estate finance, she never bothered to revoke my server access when tax season ended. I launched a secure virtual private network masking my location, and then opened the remote desktop application that connected directly to Oak Creek Holdings. The connection established instantly, welcoming me into the financial heart of Patricia's entire empire. The last remaining tear dried on my cheek. The terrified, obedient wife who had walked blistered and sobbing along the side of the highway was gone. My posture straightened, my shoulders rolling back as I stared into the glowing screen. The victim was dead. I was looking at years of Patricia's private corporate bank statements, client escrow ledgers, and internal wire transfers. Every single dollar flowing in and out of her precious firm was sitting right there in front of me, completely unprotected. A slow, chilling smile spread across my face. I was no longer prey running from a threat. I was a predator locking onto a target, and I was about to dismantle her life. The drive to my father's house took another 40 minutes, giving me time to secure my connection and verify that Patricia's server logs were not tracking my unauthorized entry. We pulled into the familiar tree-lined driveway just as the sun began to dip below the Georgia pines. My dad lived in a sprawling single-story ranch house built of solid brick. It did not have imported marble or iron gates, but it possessed a quiet, unshakable strength that Patricia's ostentatious mansion completely lacked. This was a home built on honest work, not smoke and mirrors. My dad parked the truck and hurried around to my side, helping me step down onto the concrete. The moment my blistered feet touched the ground, my legs gave out slightly, the adrenaline crash finally catching up with me. He caught my arm, steadying me with that silent reliability he had always shown. We carried Leo and the diaper bag inside. The air in the house smelled like cedar, and the faint, comforting scent of the strong black coffee my dad drank all day. I took off my ruined shoes right in the entryway, sighing as the cool hardwood floor soothed my burning skin. We went straight to the spare bedroom, a space my dad had lovingly converted into a nursery the moment he found out I was pregnant. I laid my exhausted sleeping son down in the sturdy wooden crib. I smoothed the soft blanket over his chest, watching his chest rise and fall in a steady rhythm. He was safe. He was out of their reach. I kissed his forehead and quietly pulled the door shut behind me. I walked into the kitchen to find my dad already brewing a fresh pot of coffee. He placed a heavy ceramic mug in front of me and set a first aid kit on the table, pointing silently to my feet. I bandaged my heels while the rich, dark roast worked its magic, sending a jolt of much-needed energy straight to my brain. My dad sat across from me at the solid oak kitchen table, watching intently as I pulled my laptop from the diaper bag and set it down next to my coffee mug. This table had seen me through high school chemistry homework and college exams. Tonight, it was going to serve as my war room. I took a long sip of the hot coffee, letting the caffeine sharpen my focus. Greg and Patricia genuinely believed they had me completely cornered. They thought that forcing me to quit my corporate accounting job had severed my only tie to the professional world. They assumed that because I was at home with a baby, my brain had simply switched off. They relied on the classic arrogant assumption that a stay-at-home mother is inherently disconnected from the mechanisms of power and finance. What Greg did not know, what he never bothered to pay enough attention to notice, was that I never actually stopped working. When he first started restricting my access to our checking accounts and questioning my grocery runs, I realized exactly what he was doing. I saw the cage being constructed around me, bar by bar. Instead of fighting him on his terms, which would have only caused him to tighten his grip faster, I decided to play the part he wanted. I played the compliant, stressed new mother perfectly. I let him think his financial abuse was working. Behind his back, I reached out to a former colleague who had opened a highly specialized private investigation firm. He needed an independent contractor who could untangle complex corporate fraud, someone who understood the deep, murky architecture of shell companies and hidden assets. I was a perfect fit. I formed a blind limited liability company and started taking on contracts. While Greg thought I was exhausted and sleeping when the baby slept, I was actually sitting in our guest room, with my laptop quietly tearing apart the financial ledgers of corrupt executives. I worked at night, on weekends, and during nap times. I billed premium hourly rates for my expertise, bringing in money faster than I ever had at my old 9-to-5 job. I became a phantom in the financial forensics world. Corporate lawyers sought me out specifically because I was meticulous, relentless, and completely invisible. Every time Greg handed me that humiliating allowance card with its strictly monitored limits, I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing. He thought he was starving me out, starving me into submission, while I was silently stockpiling an absolute fortune. I shifted my attention back to the glowing screen, my fingers flying across the keyboard. Before I could begin dismantling Patricia's empire, I needed to check my own armor. I opened a secure, encrypted browser, navigating to a banking portal that looked nothing like the standard retail banks Greg used. This institution was based in the Cayman Islands, heavily fortified behind layers of digital security, biometric authentication, and complex legal structures designed to protect high-net-worth individuals from exactly the kind of predatory tactics my husband was currently attempting. I typed in my complex passphrase, authenticated the login with an encrypted key generator on my phone, and waited for the screen to load. The dashboard materialized, displaying my portfolio balance in crisp, black text. The number staring back at me sat comfortably in the high six figures. It was a staggering amount of money, entirely liquid, entirely untraceable by Greg, and entirely mine. It represented 2 years of sleepless nights, relentless focus, and a quiet, burning determination to ensure my son and I would never truly be trapped. I stared at the balance, letting the reality of my absolute financial independence wash over me. The power imbalance Patricia had gloated about on her pristine patio was a complete illusion. She had threatened me with poverty and legal ruin, assuming I would fold because I lacked the resources to hire a decent attorney. She thought her wealth gave her the right to treat people like disposable garbage. She had no idea that I possessed enough liquid capital to hire a fleet of the most vicious litigators in the state and still have plenty left over to buy a new house in cash. My dad leaned forward, resting his forearms on the oak table. He glanced at the screen, his eyes widening slightly as he registered the number displayed on the banking portal. He let out a low whistle, shaking his head in a mixture of disbelief and profound pride. He looked at me, a genuine smile finally breaking through the anger that had clouded his face all afternoon. "You really did prepare for this," he said softly. "You saw this coming." I nodded, closing the banking tab and opening a fresh, secure workspace on my desktop. I felt the last lingering threads of fear evaporate, leaving behind a razor-sharp focus. I did not hide this money because I was planning to leave him right away, I explained, keeping my voice steady. I hid it because I knew the moment I pushed back, the moment I stopped playing the obedient little wife, he would try to crush me financially. I needed a war chest. I needed to make sure that when the day finally came to walk away, I could guarantee Leo's safety without having to beg or negotiate with abusers. I took another sip of coffee and cracked my knuckles. The time for hiding was officially over. I pulled up the remote desktop connection to Oak Creek Holdings Patricia's sprawling real estate firm. The directory folders populated on my screen, a massive digital filing cabinet filled with every secret she possessed. I had my safe haven. I had my hidden wealth, and I had my target locked perfectly in my sights. Now, it was time to follow the money. The screen before me displayed the primary directory for Oak Creek Holdings. I navigated the digital labyrinth with the ease of someone walking through their home. Patricia's entire financial existence was mapped out in these folders. I clicked into the master ledger, the central nervous system of her empire. My eyes scanned row after row of data. To an untrained observer, it would look like a meaningless wall of numbers, a chaotic spreadsheet of incoming and outgoing capital. To me, it was a language I spoke fluently. Every transaction told a story. Every wire transfer had a point of origin and a destination. All I had to do was follow the breadcrumbs. I started pulling up the monthly operating account statements, stacking them digitally alongside the client escrow ledgers. In the real estate business, the escrow account is absolutely sacred. It holds client deposits, earnest money, and transaction funds that legally belong to other people until a deal officially closes. You do not touch the escrow account. You do not borrow from it. You do not even look at it the wrong way. The laws governing those funds are incredibly strict, and mishandling them is the quickest way to lose a broker's license and end up in a federal penitentiary. I knew Patricia was arrogant, but I needed to know if she was desperate. I opened a customized forensic auditing software I had developed for my freelance clients. It was designed to flag anomalies, unauthorized transfers, and irregular banking patterns across massive datasets. I imported Patricia's ledgers for the last 36 months and initiated the scan. While the software crunched the numbers, my dad walked over and placed a fresh, steaming mug of coffee next to my hand. He did not ask questions. He just stood behind my chair, a silent, grounding presence in the quiet kitchen. The house was completely still, save for the rhythmic hum of the refrigerator and the soft, steady breathing of Leo coming from the nursery down the hall. My entire focus narrowed to the progress bar on my screen. I felt the familiar, cold thrill of the hunt taking over. This was the exact feeling I got when I was hired to dismantle corrupt corporate executives. The only difference was that this time, the target was the woman who had just tried to render me homeless. The progress bar reached 100%. The screen refreshed, populating a list of flagged transactions highlighted in glaring red text. I leaned closer to the monitor, my eyes narrowing as I began to decipher the pattern. It was not just a single mistake or a temporary lapse in judgment. The red flags cascaded down the screen, hundreds of them, stretching back for more than 2 years. I clicked on the first major anomaly, tracing the routing numbers. Patricia had authorized a wire transfer of $50,000 from a client escrow account directly into Oak Creek Holdings' general operating fund. 3 days later, that exact amount was dispersed to a luxury automotive dealership to cover the down payment on the very same Mercedes SUV she drove around the neighborhood. I felt a cold chill wash over my arms. I clicked on another flagged transaction. $75,000 moved from a different client trust account into a dummy corporate account. From there, it was funneled directly to a high-end landscaping firm. The dates matched perfectly with the installation of the imported travertine tile and the custom pergola on her back patio. The very same patio where she had sat, sipping a martini and calling me a freeloader. She was not just arrogant, she was a common thief. Patricia had been systematically treating her clients' earnest money deposits as her own personal piggy bank. She was running a massive illegal commingling operation to finance her lavish lifestyle. Every designer blouse, every extravagant cocktail party, every imported palm tree was paid for with stolen money. She was keeping the operation afloat by running a sophisticated Ponzi scheme using the deposits from new real estate transactions to replace the funds she had stolen from older ones just before closing. It was a fragile, high-wire act of financial fraud that required constant new business to avoid collapsing. The sheer audacity of the embezzlement was breathtaking. She was exposing herself to decades in federal prison just to maintain the illusion of generational wealth. I took a deep breath, and the magnitude of my discovery settling heavily in my chest. I had the power to destroy her entirely, but I needed to know how deep the rot actually went. Patricia was the architect of this scheme, but she rarely handled the day-to-day commercial acquisitions. That was Greg's department. I shifted my focus away from the personal expenses and began filtering the flagged transactions by commercial property addresses. I needed to see what my husband was doing while he was supposedly working 70-hour weeks and building our future. I pulled up the records for Greg's division. The data painted a picture that was even more pathetic than his behavior on the patio. Greg was not a hotshot real estate broker. He was a spectacular failure. His commercial deals were bleeding capital. His properties were sitting vacant, accumulating massive maintenance costs and property taxes that he could not afford to pay. He had completely misread the market, investing heavily in outdated retail spaces that were hemorrhaging value. He was drowning in debt. I cross-referenced Greg's failing project ledgers with Patricia's illegal escrow transfers. The connection was undeniable. The money was flowing in a continuous, desperate stream from the client trust accounts directly into Greg's commercial holding companies. Patricia was not just stealing to buy designer clothes. She was embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars to bail out her son. Greg was using stolen client money to prop up his dying real estate deals, desperately trying to maintain the facade of a successful businessman. He was a full co-conspirator in a federal crime. I stared at the screen, my hands resting still on the keyboard. All the times Greg had scolded me about grocery budgets, all the times he had made me feel guilty for buying diapers, all the times he claimed money was tight because he was reinvesting in his brilliant career. It was all a lie. He was stealing money to cover his own incompetence, and he was using me as a scapegoat to vent his frustration. He had restricted my access to our accounts, not just to control me, but to ensure I never accidentally saw the massive infusions of stolen cash keeping his head above water. I leaned back in my chair, letting the magnitude of their deception wash over me. The resentment I had harbored for 2 years crystallized into something sharp and dangerous. Greg had stood on that patio, hiding behind his mother, judging me for having no income. He had allowed Patricia to threaten me with absolute ruin, fully confident in his own superiority. But his entire life was constructed on a foundation of stolen money and desperate lies. He was not a provider. He was just a parasite, feeding off innocent clients. I looked at the digital trail of evidence illuminating my screen. Every keystroke had tightened the noose around their necks. I had enough proof to send my husband and my mother-in-law to federal prison. The financial rot was exposed, but I was not finished digging through his secrets. I shifted my focus from the macro level of the firm's escrow accounts down to the micro level of Greg's daily operating expenses. If he was funneling stolen client money to keep his commercial properties afloat, I needed to see exactly how he was managing the cash flow that was supposed to be dedicated to his business overhead. I opened the digital ledger for his primary corporate American Express card. This was the card he claimed was strictly monitored by Patricia for legitimate client entertaining and professional travel. I began scrolling through the monthly statements, my eyes carefully scanning merchants and dollar amounts. At first glance, it looked like standard corporate bloat. There were regular charges for expensive steakhouses, golf course green fees, and domestic flights. But as I adjusted my forensic filtering software to isolate recurring, non-business expenditures, a glaring, undeniable anomaly jumped off the screen. Tucked between legitimate vendor payments and office supply invoices were consistent, exorbitant charges that had absolutely nothing to do with commercial real estate. I stared at a string of transactions from a luxury boutique hotel located straight downtown in the city. The charges occurred almost every single Thursday afternoon, spanning back continuously for the last 8 months. I clicked on the itemized receipts. These were not conference room rentals or business lunches. They were charges for executive suites room service champagne and expensive couples spa treatments. My chest tightened uncomfortably as I kept scrolling. The hotel bookings were just the beginning. I found a massive charge at a high-end jeweler in Buckhead for a diamond tennis bracelet processed 2 days before my birthday. I remembered that birthday vividly. Greg had handed me a generic gift card to a department store, claiming his commissions were tied up and we needed to be frugal because of the new baby. He had complained bitterly that week about the rising cost of organic baby food. Meanwhile, he was dropping thousands of dollars on diamonds with a corporate credit card funded by stolen escrow money. The sheer audacity of the spending made my pulse pound heavily in my ears. I needed to know exactly where the jewelry and the hotel suites were going. I switched from the credit card statements to Greg's direct operating accounts, specifically looking for peer-to-peer wire transfers. Greg was exceptionally arrogant, but he was also surprisingly lazy. He had not even bothered to mask the transactions through a dummy vendor. I found a recurring weekly wire transfer of $1,500, labeled vaguely as administrative consulting fees. The funds were being routed directly into a personal checking account at a local credit union. I highlighted the routing data and ran a trace using my forensic tools to pull the registered name on the receiving account. The software processed the request and quickly spit back a name I did not immediately recognize. It was a young woman. I opened a new browser window, navigating away from the secure banking portal for a moment to pull up the official staff directory on the Oak Creek Holdings public website. I scrolled through the glossy professional headshots of the real estate brokers and property managers until I found her. She was listed as a junior commercial leasing agent, assigned directly to Greg's division. She was 24 years old, fresh out of college, with a bright, eager smile and long blonde hair. I opened a separate tab and typed her name into a social media search. Her public profiles were a curated feed of expensive dinners, luxury hotel lobbies, and brand new designer accessories. There was a photo of her wearing the exact diamond tennis bracelet I had seen on the credit card statement, captioned with a heart emoji and a note about being spoiled by her absolute favorite mentor. Another photo showed her posing happily in the lobby of the downtown boutique hotel on a Thursday afternoon. The realization hit me with the physical force of a breathless punch to the gut. The air vanished from my lungs, and I slumped back against the hard wooden rungs of the chair. My husband was not just a coward who allowed his mother to mentally abuse me. He was not just a white-collar criminal who embezzled client funds to cover his own professional failures. He was actively carrying on a long-term affair with a woman nearly a decade younger than me, bringing her into his office and funding her lavish lifestyle with stolen money, while simultaneously starving his own wife and infant son. A sharp, searing pang of grief flared intensely in the center of my chest. I thought about the lonely nights I had stayed up pacing the floor with a colicky Leo, completely exhausted, while Greg claimed he had to work late to close a tough deal. I thought about the countless times I had blamed myself for the emotional distance growing between us, wondering if I had let myself go, wondering if I was failing as a wife because I was struggling as a new mother. I had carried the heavy burden of marital guilt, truly believing I was the problem in our marriage. The pain was sharp, but it was incredibly brief. It lasted only a few fleeting seconds before it was completely incinerated by a massive wave of cold, calculating, and absolute rage. The tears did not return. My vision tunneled, becoming exceptionally crystal clear. The last remaining tether of loyalty I felt toward the father of my child snapped cleanly in two. He had made his selfish choices, and now he was going to face the most catastrophic consequences imaginable. I leaned forward, pulling my chair closer to the table, my fingers hovering over the keyboard with predatory precision. I did not have time to sit and wallow in heartbreak. I had a digital arsenal to build. I opened a highly secure, encrypted mass storage application on my laptop. I systematically began extracting every single piece of evidence I had uncovered over the last 4 hours. I downloaded the master ledgers detailing Patricia's systemic escrow fraud. I exported the wire transfer receipts, proving Greg was siphoning stolen client funds into his failing commercial properties. I pulled the complete historical data of his corporate credit card, highlighting the jewelry purchases, the weekly hotel suites, and the direct cash deposits to his young mistress. I captured the digital footprints, the exact timestamps, and the specific IP addresses associated with every fraudulent transaction. I was meticulously building an airtight, irrefutable case that no high-priced defense attorney would ever be able to dismantle in a courtroom. Once the data extraction was complete, I compressed the massive volume of financial records into a series of highly secure, password-protected folders. I uploaded the encrypted files to 3 separate offshore cloud servers, ensuring that even if my physical laptop was destroyed or confiscated, the evidence would remain safely out of their desperate reach forever. For good measure, I copied the entire archive onto a high-capacity encrypted flash drive that I immediately slipped safely into my front pocket. I sat back and watched the final loading progress bar reach 100%, and let out a long, slow breath. The trap was fully loaded. My father walked over silently and rested his heavy hand firmly on my shoulder. I looked up at him, my expression completely devoid of fear. I had absolutely everything I needed to burn their fake empire to the ground. Monday morning broke with a deceptive brightness, the Georgia sun already baking the dew off the grass by the time I carried Leo into the kitchen. My dad was at the stove, flipping eggs with one hand and holding a travel mug of coffee in the other. He had already been up for hours, making calls and rearranging his schedule to make sure he was home with me. I set Leo in the high chair I had retrieved from the spare room, handing him a handful of dry cereal to keep him occupied. I poured myself a cup of coffee, the aroma strong and grounding, and leaned against the counter. The exhaustion of the weekend was deep in my bones, but my mind was racing with the sheer volume of evidence I had secured the night before. I had slept fitfully, waking every few hours to check my laptop, irrationally terrified that the encrypted files had vanished. But they were still there, safe in the cloud, waiting to be weaponized. My phone vibrated on the counter, the harsh buzz shattering the quiet morning routine. I picked it up, staring at the screen. The name Greg blinked back at me. I did not answer. I let it ring until it went to voicemail. 30 seconds later, the phone pinged with a text message. It was a long block of text, composed with the kind of arrogant precision that usually required his mother's dictation. I read it slowly, my blood turning to ice water in my veins. Lauren, since you decided to act completely unstable and kidnap my son across county lines, I have no choice but to protect him. My mother's lawyer is filing for emergency full physical and legal custody first thing this morning. You have no job, no car, and you are currently homeless and living off your father's charity. A judge will see exactly how unhinged you are. Do not try to fight this. You will only embarrass yourself further. He was actually doing it. He was attempting to use the very dependency he had engineered as a weapon to strip my child away from me. The sheer audacity of the threat was breathtaking. He had abandoned his wife and son on the side of a highway, and now he was framing himself as the protective father, rescuing his child from a deranged mother. I handed my dad the phone, unable to speak around the sudden, suffocating knot of panic lodged in my throat. I knew the truth about his finances. I knew about the mistress. I had the digital evidence of his corporate fraud safely encrypted on offshore servers. But the visceral terror of a man threatening to take my baby bypassed all logic and hit me right in the primal core of my being. My dad read the message, his jaw clenching so hard a muscle twitched in his cheek. He did not yell. He did not throw the phone. He set it down on the counter with deliberate, frightening care. Let him file whatever fantasy he wants, my dad said, his voice a low, steady rumble. It takes a lot more than a whiny text message to take a baby away from a good mother. He is trying to scare you into making a mistake. Do not give him the satisfaction. I took a shaky breath, forcing myself to look away from the phone and focus on Leo, who was happily smashing a Cheerio against the tray of his high chair. Before I could respond, the sharp chime of the doorbell echoed through the house. My dad and I exchanged a tense look. He rarely got visitors this early in the morning, and nobody in my family knew I was here except Greg and Patricia. My dad walked to the front door, pulling it open. A young man in a cheap, rumpled suit stood on the porch, holding a thick manila envelope. He looked bored, clearly accustomed to delivering bad news before most people had finished their morning coffee. "Are you William?" the man asked, glancing down at a clipboard. My dad crossed his arms over his chest. "I am. What do you want?" "Is Lauren present at this address?" the process server asked, stepping slightly to the side to peer past my father's broad shoulders. "I need to serve these documents directly to her." I walked into the entryway, my heart hammering a chaotic rhythm against my ribs. "I am Lauren," I said, my voice remarkably steady, despite the fear coursing through me. The man handed me the manila envelope. "You have been served," he muttered, turning on his heel and jogging back to his nondescript sedan parked on the street. I ripped open the envelope, my hands shaking as I pulled out the thick stack of legal documents. It was not custody papers. It was a formal 30-day notice of eviction for the marital home, stamped and signed by Patricia, acting as the managing partner of Oak Creek Holdings. Attached to the eviction notice was a patronizing letter demanding that I coordinate with Greg to retrieve my personal belongings during specific supervised windows. They were officially kicking me out of the house I had decorated, the house where I had built Leo's nursery, the house I had scrubbed and maintained while Greg was out spending stolen money on hotel suites with a 24-year-old leasing agent. "They are evicting me," I whispered, staring blindly at the harsh, legal language. Patricia signed it herself. My dad took the papers from my trembling hands, his eyes scanning the aggressive legal jargon. "They are throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks," he said, tossing the entire stack onto the entryway table like it was garbage. "It is an intimidation tactic, Lauren. They think if they hit you with enough paperwork, you will panic and beg for a settlement on their terms." As if on cue, my phone rang again. This time, I did not hesitate. I picked it up and answered the call, pressing the phone to my ear without saying a word. Lauren Gregg's voice came through the speaker, dripping with a sickening manufactured sympathy. "I hope you got the papers. I told my mother to hold off, but she insisted. Look, I do not want this to get ugly. I know you are probably terrified right now. You are out of your depth, and I do not want to see you destroyed in family court." I remained completely silent, letting him talk, letting him dig the hole deeper. "I am willing to offer you a very generous compromise," Greg continued, his tone shifting into the smooth, practiced cadence he used to close real estate deals. "If you agree to sign a settlement today, waiving any claim to spousal support or the contents of the house, I will convince my mother's lawyer to hold off on the emergency custody filing. I will even agree to let you have weekend visitation with Leo once you find an apartment and get a job. It is a really good deal, Lauren. You walk away cleanly, and I will not drag your mental health issues into the public record." He was offering me weekend visitation with my own infant son as if he were granting me a profound act of charity. He wanted me to walk away completely destitute, terrified, and grateful for the scraps he was willing to throw me. He actually believed he was holding all the cards. He believed his mother's money and power made him invincible. He had no idea that I spent the entire night downloading his financial death warrant onto an encrypted flash drive. I listened to him breathe into the receiver, waiting for me to break down, waiting for me to sob and accept his terrible, insulting offer. I did not cry. I did not yell. I just pulled the phone away from my ear, tapped the red button to end the call, and set the device face down on the counter. I looked at my dad. The last remnants of the terrified, compliant wife completely burned away. "I need a lawyer, Dad," I said, my voice cold and hard as steel. "And I do not want a mediator. I want a shark." I turned to my dad. "I need to go to the bank, and then I need to find the most ruthless family law attorney in this state." My dad did not hesitate. He grabbed his keys from the counter. "There is a firm downtown. The senior partner is a man named Arthur Vance. He represented a buddy of mine during a brutal corporate divorce a few years back. The man is a complete shark. He does not play nice and he does not lose. He is exactly what we need." We loaded Leo back into the truck. The drive downtown was silent, the tension in the cab thick enough to cut with a knife. I spent the entire ride transferring funds from my offshore account to a domestic, untraceable cashier's check. Greg thought he could starve me out, but he had no idea what it actually cost to go to war. We pulled up to a sleek, glass-fronted building in the heart of Atlanta's financial district. The law offices of Vance Sterling and Associates took up the entire top floor. The lobby was all polished marble and quiet, aggressive wealth. I walked up to the receptionist holding Leo on my hip. I told her I needed an emergency consultation with Mr. Vance. She gave me a polite, dismissive smile and told me Mr. Vance was booked for the next 3 weeks. I pulled the cashier's check for $50,000 out of my purse and laid it flat on her pristine desk. I told her to tell Mr. Vance that my husband just threatened to take my child, and I am here to hire him to make sure that never happens. She looked at the check, her eyes widening slightly, and picked up her phone. 10 minutes later, I was sitting in a massive corner office overlooking the city skyline. Arthur Vance was a man in his late 50s, with sharp, calculating eyes and a demeanor that completely stripped away any pretense of pleasantries. He did not offer condolences for my failing marriage. He just steepled his fingers and told me to start talking. I did not waste his time with emotional venting. I pulled my encrypted flash drive from my pocket and slid it across the mahogany desk. I told him that my husband Greg had just filed an emergency custody order to take my son. I told him Greg and his mother Patricia had served me with an eviction notice for our marital home. Then I told him exactly what was on the drive. I detailed the systematic financial abuse, the illegal commingling of client escrow funds, the long-term affair with the 24-year-old leasing agent funded by stolen corporate money, and the offshore accounts I had built to protect myself. Mr. Vance plugged the drive into his laptop. He spent the next 45 minutes clicking through the meticulously organized folders, scanning the ledgers, the wire transfers, and the hotel receipts. The silence in the office was absolute. When he finally looked up, his expression had shifted from professional detachment to genuine predatory interest. "You compiled all of this yourself?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded. He leaned back in his leather chair, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. "Lauren, I have been practicing family law for 30 years. I have never seen a client walk into my office with a case this perfectly weaponized. Your husband just handed us the rope, and you brought the scaffolding. We are going to hang him out to dry." He immediately called his paralegal into the office. The strategy shifted from defense to an overwhelming scorched earth offense. Mr. Vance explained that Greg's emergency custody filing was a standard intimidation tactic, completely baseless without proof of endangerment. But the evidence I had provided gave us grounds to file a devastating countersuit. "We are filing for a temporary restraining order based on financial abuse and intimidation." Mr. Vance instructed his team, his words firing off like bullets. "We are petitioning for immediate sole physical and legal custody of the child." Then he looked back at me. "But the real leverage is the money. We are going to paralyze him." Mr. Vance drafted an emergency motion to freeze every single one of Greg's personal and corporate banking accounts. He cited irrefutable documented evidence of extreme marital waste, specifically detailing the thousands of dollars Greg had spent on his mistress using commingled funds. Because Greg was actively moving stolen money across state lines to fund his failing commercial properties, Mr. Vance argued he was a significant flight risk and a danger to the marital estate. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, the paperwork was filed with the county courthouse. The judge, reviewing the mountain of pristine financial evidence, granted the emergency injunctions without hesitation. The trap was officially set. Greg's entire financial existence was about to be locked down tighter than a drum. I walked out of the law firm feeling lighter than I had in years. The terrifying threat of losing Leo was neutralized. The legal shield was firmly in place. Now, all we had to do was wait for Greg to realize he had brought a knife to a gunfight. Across town, the lunchtime rush was in full swing downtown. Greg sat in a plush booth, feeling entirely invincible. Across the white tablecloth sat his 24-year-old leasing agent, sipping sparkling water. He had spent the morning feeling smug about the eviction notice his mother arranged. He signaled the waiter, ordering vintage champagne and fresh oysters. He leaned across the table, bragging about his upcoming commercial warehouse deal, as if he had secured the $50 million. When the waiter brought the check, Greg did not even look at the total. He pulled his heavy corporate credit card from his wallet and dropped it onto the tray with practiced nonchalance. He continued his conversation, already planning which hotel suite they would occupy. 5 minutes later, the waiter returned. The young man looked deeply uncomfortable, clearing his throat quietly. He leaned down and whispered that the card had been declined. Greg felt a flash of hot irritation. He snatched the card back, loudly complaining about bank security holding up legitimate transactions. He assured his companion it was a minor administrative glitch. He pulled out his personal platinum card, handing it over with an arrogant smirk. The waiter hurried away, only to return 2 minutes later, looking even more apologetic. That card was declined as well. The smirk vanished from Greg's face. A cold, creeping sensation started at the base of his neck. He muttered a terse apology to the leasing agent, claiming there must be a system outage at his bank. He pulled out his phone, his hands suddenly trembling slightly as he opened his banking application. The scanner read his face and the dashboard loaded. Greg stared at the screen, all the blood draining from his head. Across the top of every single account flashed a glaring red banner. Account frozen. Court order enforced. He tapped frantically on the screen, trying to refresh the application, his breath catching in his throat. He opened his investment portfolio app. Frozen. He checked his backup emergency credit lines. Frozen. Every single dollar he had access to, every cent of the stolen money he used to prop up his fake empire, was entirely locked down. He looked up at the young woman sitting across from him, realizing with absolute horror that he could not even pay for the oysters they had just eaten. The illusion of his immense wealth evaporated in seconds, leaving him sitting in a crowded restaurant with a declined card and a mounting sense of panic. He excused himself abruptly, stumbling away from the table and practically running toward the exit. He needed to call his mother, but as he scrolled through his contacts, his thumb hovered over my name. The realization hit him like a freight train. The eviction notice, the emergency custody filing. He had provoked me and, inexplicably, I had struck back with a force that obliterated his entire reality. I was sitting at my father's kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee, when my phone began to vibrate against the wood surface. The caller ID flashed Greg's name. My dad slowly lowered the newspaper he was reading. He looked at the buzzing phone, then looked at me, a silent question in his eyes. I did not rush to pick it up. I let it ring, counting the seconds, savoring the absolute shift in power. I knew exactly what was happening on the other end of that line. Arthur Vance's paralegal had emailed me 20 minutes earlier to confirm that the asset freeze had been successfully executed across all banking institutions. On the fifth ring, I swiped the green button, lifting the phone to my ear. I did not say hello. I just sat in the quiet kitchen and listened. Lauren Gregg practically screamed into the receiver. His voice was a frantic, high-pitched wheeze that sounded absolutely nothing like the arrogant man who had stood on Patricia's patio the day before. "What did you do? What did you just do to my accounts?" I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. I listened to the sounds of heavy traffic in the background on his end. He was clearly outside, pacing frantically on a sidewalk somewhere. "I protected my son," I said, my voice completely smooth and untroubled. "I protected myself from a man who thought he could use my child as a bargaining chip." You froze. Everything Greg yelled, his panic overtaking him. He was hyperventilating, struggling to draw a breath. "My corporate cards are shut off. My personal checking is gone. I am sitting at a restaurant right now and I cannot pay the tab. They are threatening to call the police." "How did you do this? How did you get a court order? You do not have any money. You do not have a lawyer. You are supposed to be out of the house by tomorrow." The sheer desperation in his voice was a stark contrast to the cruel, patronizing tone he had used hours earlier when he offered me weekend visitation with Leo. He could not comprehend how the compliant housewife he had financially starved had managed to execute a legal strike of this magnitude. "I hired Arthur Vance," I replied calmly, letting the name of the most feared family law attorney in Atlanta sink in. "And he was very interested in the documentation I provided regarding your extreme marital waste." The judge seemed alarmed by the thousands of dollars you have been spending on boutique hotel suites and diamond bracelets for your leasing agent. There was a sudden, suffocating silence on the other end of the line. The realization that I knew about his mistress, that I had handed that information over to a judge, hit him with the force of a physical blow. "Lauren, please," Greg stammered, his arrogance entirely shattered, replaced by raw terror. "You have to undo this. You do not understand what is happening. If my mother finds out, you froze the corporate accounts. The whole firm is going to collapse. We have a $50 million closing at the end of the week. If the escrow accounts are locked, everything is over. You are ruining my life. Please, I will withdraw the custody papers. I will tell my mom to cancel the eviction." "Just call your lawyer and tell him to release the funds." He was begging. The man who had watched me blister my feet walking along the highway, the man who had let his mother call me a freeloader, was now pleading for his financial survival. He wanted to negotiate a truce now that he was completely disarmed. I looked across the kitchen table at my father. He gave me a slow, firm nod. I did not feel an ounce of pity for the man hyperventilating on the phone. I felt nothing but a profound sense of justice. The cage he had built around me was destroyed, and he was now locked firmly inside his own. "Greg," I said, keeping my tone perfectly conversational, as if we were discussing the weather rather than the demolition of his life. "I am not calling my lawyer. I am not undoing anything. You made your choices when you tried to take my baby from me. Now you get to live with the consequences." "But I am stranded downtown," he cried out, his voice cracking with humiliation. "I cannot pay this restaurant bill. I do not have $1 to my name right now. How am I supposed to get back to the office? How am I supposed to get home?" I let his questions hang in the air for a long moment. I remembered the searing heat of the asphalt through my thin sandals. I remembered the weight of my crying son on my hip as cars sped past us. I remembered looking into Greg's eyes, begging for my car keys, only to be met with a cowardly smirk. I took one final, satisfying breath. "Try Uber, Greg," I replied. I pulled the phone away from my ear, pressed the red button, and ended the call. I would later learn exactly what happened in the immediate aftermath of that phone call. Greg sat in the bustling downtown restaurant, staring at his dead phone screen. The ambient chatter of the lunchtime rush buzzed around him, but all he could hear was the rushing of blood in his ears. His 24-year-old leasing agent, the woman he had been impressing just 20 minutes prior with champagne, looked at him with mounting irritation. She asked him what was taking so long and why the waiter was hovering near the host stand with the restaurant manager. Greg could not form a coherent sentence. He patted his pockets frantically, realizing he had zero cash on him. He relied on the limitless power of his corporate platinum card. Now that piece of plastic was just a worthless piece of trash. With no other options, Greg was forced to endure the ultimate humiliation. He had to walk over to the restaurant manager, explain that his bank was experiencing a catastrophic error, and leave his expensive Rolex watch as collateral just to be allowed out the front door. He then had to beg his mistress to order them a rideshare back to the office on her personal app. They rode in total silence, the glamorous illusion of Greg's wealth entirely shattered. The moment the car pulled up to the corporate headquarters of Oak Creek Holdings, Greg sprinted inside, leaving her to pay the fare. He bypassed the reception desk and burst directly into Patricia's sprawling corner office. He found his mother standing behind her massive mahogany desk, screaming furiously into her desk phone. Her pristine, composed facade had completely dissolved. Her face was flushed, and her perfect hair was slightly disheveled. She slammed the phone down onto the receiver so hard the plastic cracked. She looked at Greg, her eyes wild with a mixture of rage and absolute terror. She told him that the bank had just informed her of a court-ordered asset freeze. It was not just Greg's personal checking accounts. Because Patricia had tied his commercial holding companies directly to the primary operating funds, the judge's injunction had cast a massive, inescapable net over the entire firm. Greg collapsed into one of the leather guest chairs, burying his face in his hands. He confessed that he had spoken to me. He admitted that I had hired Arthur Vance and that I knew about the mistress, the hotel rooms, and the jewelry. Patricia leaned heavily against her desk, the air seemingly knocked out of her lungs. The sheer magnitude of her miscalculation was finally dawning on her. She had threatened a woman she thought was a helpless, penniless housewife, only to have that same woman execute a flawless legal strike that paralyzed her empire in less than 24 hours. It was not just the embarrassment of losing access to her wealth that was causing Patricia to hyperventilate. It was the terrifying reality of what a frozen bank account meant for her darkest secret. Patricia knew that if the accounts remained frozen, checks would start bouncing, vendor payments would be declined. Most importantly, client escrow disbursements would fail to clear. If a client complained to the State Real Estate Commission about a failed escrow transfer, it would trigger an immediate, mandatory audit. An audit would instantly reveal the massive gaping hole where millions of dollars of client funds used to be. The systemic embezzlement scheme she had been running to finance her lifestyle and cover Greg's massive commercial losses would be exposed to federal authorities. She was looking at the very real prospect of spending the rest of her natural life in a federal penitentiary. Greg looked up at his mother, his voice trembling as he articulated the exact same fear. He reminded her about the warehouse project. Their entire reputation and all of Patricia's dwindling stolen cash reserves were tied up in one massive final project. For the past year, they had been desperately trying to close a $50 million commercial warehouse park on the outskirts of the city. It was the only thing that could save them. It was a massive development, meant to serve as a regional distribution hub, and it was the lifeline they needed to legitimize their stolen funds. They had poured every last cent of the embezzled escrow money into securing the land and laying the foundation, gambling everything on the belief that the final payout would cover their tracks. They absolutely had to close this deal by Friday. If the final phase of funding did not arrive by Friday afternoon, the entire project would default. The contractors would walk off the job, the property would go into foreclosure, and the missing escrow funds would be impossible to hide any longer. Their survival depended entirely on a massive, anonymous private equity firm that had agreed to provide the final phase of funding. This private equity firm was the sole investor keeping Oak Creek Holdings from completely drowning. The negotiations had been handled through teams of corporate lawyers, and Patricia had never even met the principal investors face to face. All she cared about was that their commitment paperwork was signed and the $50 million wire transfer was scheduled to hit her accounts by the end of the week. Patricia paced behind her desk, her mind racing as she tried to construct a lifeline out of thin air. She stopped and looked at her son, forcing her features back into a mask of arrogant confidence. She refused to let me, the woman she considered a peasant, be the reason her empire fell. She walked over to Greg and grabbed him by the shoulders, shaking him slightly to snap him out of his panic. She told him to pull himself together and stop acting like a defeated coward. She insisted that this asset freeze was nothing more than a temporary, irritating roadblock. Patricia laid out her desperate plan. She explained that Arthur Vance was a shark, but even a shark needed time to navigate the slow, bureaucratic gears of the family court system. She assured Greg that the temporary injunction was just a preliminary measure based on my accusations of marital waste. She convinced him that they could easily delay any formal financial disclosures until after Friday. All they had to do was hold their breath and keep the illusion alive for 4 more days. Once that private equity money cleared on Friday afternoon, Patricia promised everything would change. The massive influx of legitimate capital would wash away their sins. The warehouse park deal would close, instantly generating millions of dollars in legitimate broker commissions and development fees. She told Greg that they could use those clean, freshly earned commissions to quietly replace the missing escrow funds before anyone even noticed they were gone. They would be rich, legitimate, and completely untouchable. Patricia's eyes gleamed with a toxic, revitalized sense of superiority. She told Greg that the second the warehouse deal was finalized and their accounts were flush with clean cash, she was going to hire an entire team of ruthless corporate litigators to destroy Arthur Vance in court. She promised Greg that they would use their newly secured wealth to unfreeze the accounts, countersue me into absolute oblivion, and make sure I never saw Leo again. She told him that by this time next week, they would be celebrating the biggest victory of their lives, and I would be completely ruined. While Patricia and Greg clung to their desperate delusion of victory inside that mahogany office I was sitting at, my father's kitchen table, systematically tearing their reality apart. Tuesday morning brought a quiet, focused energy to the house. My dad had taken Leo to the park at the end of the neighborhood, giving me the absolute silence I needed to execute the next phase of my plan. The encrypted files containing the forensic audit of Oak Creek Holdings were fully organized on my screen. I did not need to wait for Arthur Vance and the slow-turning wheels of the family court system to bleed Patricia dry. I had the power to do it myself with a few simple keystrokes. I opened a secure, anonymous email routing service that masked my IP address completely. I was not going to send the entire audit. That would be too messy and too easy for Patricia to write off as a disgruntled competitor making wild accusations. Instead, I carefully selected 3 of Patricia's highest net worth clients. These were massive commercial developers and wealthy private investors who held multi-million-dollar escrow accounts with her firm. They were the very foundation of her business reputation. I extracted the specific ledger pages that detailed how their earnest money deposits had been illegally siphoned into Greg's failing warehouse holding companies. I redacted just enough sensitive information to protect the innocent buyers, but I left the routing numbers, the timestamps, and the glaring zero balances completely visible. I drafted a very brief, highly professional message to accompany the files. I presented myself as an anonymous whistleblower within the financial compliance sector. I strongly advised these clients to demand an immediate, independent, third-party audit of their escrow accounts with Oak Creek Holdings prior to the close of business on Wednesday. I attached the encrypted ledgers and pressed send. I leaned back in my wooden chair, taking a slow sip of my coffee. The digital bombs were officially in the air. Now all I had to do was watch them detonate. The impact was not immediate. It took exactly 42 minutes for the first email to be opened, read, and digested by a furious billionaire investor. I knew this because I was still logged into Patricia's central accounting server via my remote desktop connection. I was watching the internal network activity monitor in real time. Across town at Oak Creek Holdings, the false sense of security that Patricia had just instilled in Greg was shattered by the shrill ring of her private direct line. Patricia answered the phone using her smoothest, most practiced customer service voice. That voice cracked immediately when the investor on the other end bypassed all pleasantries and demanded to know why his $2 million escrow deposit was currently sitting in a holding LLC registered to her son. The investor did not ask politely. He screamed that he had just received a whistleblower packet containing internal ledgers. He threatened to call the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the State Real Estate Commission, and every local news outlet if his money was not verified by an independent auditor within 24 hours. Before Patricia could even attempt to formulate a lie to placate him, her secondary line began to flash brightly. Then Greg's phone rang. Then the main receptionist console out in the lobby lit up like a Christmas tree. The dominoes were falling exactly as I had calculated. The anonymous emails had sparked an absolute wildfire of panic among the city's financial elite. I sat in my dad's quiet kitchen, watching the digital chaos unfold on my screen. The server logs showed multiple users within Patricia's office frantically accessing the accounting directories. Greg logged in from his terminal, his cursor moving erratically across the screen as he desperately tried to open the client files to see exactly what had been leaked. I could practically smell the terror radiating through the network connection. Patricia was trapped. She could not freeze the accounts herself, and she could not produce the missing millions because that money had already been spent on diamond bracelets, luxury hotel suites, and bad commercial investments. In a state of sheer, unadulterated panic, Patricia made the worst possible mistake a white-collar criminal can make when they realize they are caught. She tried to cover her tracks while the spotlight was shining directly on her. She sprinted to the desk of her lead accountant, practically shoving the woman out of the way to take control of the main terminal. She needed to shuffle whatever remaining legitimate funds she had left to create the illusion that the wealthy client's escrow accounts were still whole. She was hoping to stall them just long enough for Friday's private equity funding to arrive. On my screen, I watched her log into the primary operating account using her executive credentials. My screen recording software was capturing every single frame of her activity in high-definition video. She initiated a series of rapid, chaotic wire transfers. She pulled operating capital intended for employee payroll. She drained the marketing budget. She even attempted to transfer funds from a separate residential escrow account to plug the massive hole in the commercial trust. It was a frantic, sloppy, and entirely illegal display of financial desperation. She was robbing Peter to pay Paul in broad daylight. Every time she clicked confirm on a fraudulent transfer, my software captured the digital signature and the timestamp. She was actively tampering with financial records and committing wire fraud right in front of my eyes. She had no idea that her former daughter-in-law, the woman she had dismissed as a useless dependent, was sitting miles away, drinking coffee and documenting every single felony she was currently committing. The internal server chat application popped up on my screen. I could see the frantic messages flying between Patricia and Greg. Greg typed in all capital letters asking her what they were going to do and telling her that another major client was threatening to send their legal team to the office immediately. Patricia responded with a barrage of misspelled messages ordering him to shut the office doors, send the receptionist home early, and stop answering the phones. She told him to pack up the physical ledgers from the filing room and put them in the trunk of his car. She was ordering the destruction and concealment of physical evidence. I took a screenshot of the chat log, adding it to my growing mountain of irrefutable proof. They were acting like cornered animals, completely abandoning any pretense of running a legitimate business. I watched her cursor frantically dart across the screen as she tried to access the very accounts that Arthur Vance had frozen just hours earlier. She received the same glaring red error messages that Greg had seen at the restaurant. Access denied. Court order enforced. The realization must have hit her with crippling force. She could not move the money she needed because the family court judge had locked it down tight. My legal strike and my digital strike had converged flawlessly, trapping her in an inescapable vice. She had nowhere to run. She had furious billionaires breathing down her neck, demanding audits she could never pass. And she had an invisible predator watching her every move, recording her desperate attempts to commit further fraud. I smiled, closed my laptop securely, and finished my cold coffee. Their empire was burning, and I held the match. My dad walked back into the kitchen, the heavy tread of his worn boots providing a comforting, steady rhythm against the hardwood floor. He had just put Leo down for his afternoon nap in the nursery, the baby completely oblivious to the intense digital warfare unfolding just a few rooms away. My father pulled out the heavy oak chair across from me and sat down with a tired sigh. He rested his elbows on the table, folding his large, calloused hands together. He looked closely at my face, studying the sharp, unyielding expression I now wore. He did not see the broken, weeping woman he had picked up from the side of the blistering road yesterday afternoon. He saw his daughter, wide awake, deeply focused, and fighting back with everything she had. He nodded toward the closed laptop resting quietly under my hands. He asked me, in a low voice, if the first phase of my plan was done. I took a deep, steadying breath, letting the residual adrenaline slowly filter out of my bloodstream. I told him that the absolute panic had officially set in over at Oak Creek Holdings. I explained that Patricia was currently running around her corner office, frantically trying to plug million-dollar holes with pennies, and that her wealthiest, most powerful clients were already breathing down her neck, demanding immediate third-party audits. My dad let out a low, deeply satisfied chuckle. He leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under his solid weight. He asked me how long they could realistically keep the plates spinning before the entire criminal operation collapsed under its own massive weight. I leaned back as well, tracing the smooth ceramic rim of my empty coffee mug with my index finger. I laid out the exact timeline for him. I explained that Patricia and Greg were completely desperate, but they were not entirely out of moves just yet. I told him about the massive commercial warehouse park Greg had been trying desperately to close for the past 12 months. I broke down the complex financial numbers, explaining how they had sunk every last cent of their stolen escrow capital into securing the land and prepping the development site on the outskirts of the city. I told my dad that their entire survival, both financial and legal, hinged completely on this single $50 million project. If they could just manage to make it to Friday afternoon, a massive private equity firm was scheduled to wire the final phase of development funding. That huge influx of clean, legitimate cash would be more than enough to temporarily blind their angry clients, finalize the massive real estate commissions, and allow Patricia to quietly replace the stolen escrow money before any federal authorities got involved. Friday was their absolute, undeniable deadline. If that specific wire transfer did not arrive, the contractors would walk off the job, the property would go into immediate default, and the federal investigators would be knocking on Patricia's front door by Monday morning. My father listened intently to every word, his thick brow furrowing as he absorbed the complex financial mechanics of Patricia's sheer desperation. He tapped his thumb against the wooden table, a slow, rhythmic beat that echoed loudly in the quiet kitchen. He asked me if I knew the specific name of this mysterious private equity firm that was about to bail them out of federal prison. I nodded, opening my laptop screen just enough to pull the encrypted contract file from my secure drive. I scanned the legal documents I had downloaded the night before. I read the name out loud, directly off the glowing screen. I told him the funding was coming from an investment group called Vanguard Sterling Equity. They operated mostly out of Chicago, utilizing a complex network of anonymous shell corporations to fund massive commercial supply chain developments across the Southeast. I closed the laptop again, waiting for his reaction. I fully expected him to ask how we could possibly contact a faceless Chicago investment firm to warn them about Patricia's massive fraud before Friday. Instead, my father went completely still. The rhythmic tapping of his thumb on the oak table stopped instantly. A strange, heavy silence descended over the kitchen, thick with sudden anticipation. I watched in total confusion as a slow, deliberate smile spread across his weathered face. It was the exact same chilling, predatory smile he had given Patricia on her pristine, travertine patio yesterday afternoon, when she threatened to leave me homeless. I frowned, utterly baffled by his strange reaction to the name of the firm. I asked him what could possibly be so funny about Vanguard Sterling Equity handing Greg $50 million to save his fraudulent career. My dad crossed his arms over his chest. He looked at me with a mixture of immense pride and deep paternal amusement. He asked me if I remembered when he aggressively expanded his trucking routes about 5 years ago, shifting his business from simple regional deliveries to a massive nationwide logistics network. I nodded, remembering how incredibly hard he had worked during that grueling expansion period, spending weeks on the road securing lucrative corporate contracts and buying up smaller shipping companies to build his fleet. My father explained that when you move that much freight across the entire country, you eventually stop relying on other people's storage warehouses. He said that paying rent to arrogant commercial landlords was a fool's game when you had the capital to own the concrete and the steel yourself. He leaned forward, locking his eyes with mine. He told me that 2 years ago, his primary logistics corporation created a subsidiary investment branch specifically designed to acquire and develop massive commercial warehouse parks. He explained that he needed a clean, anonymous corporate entity to handle the real estate acquisitions without drawing unwanted attention to his main shipping empire, keeping the market from hiking up land prices the second they saw a major logistics giant coming to town. He looked me dead in the eye, his smile widening into a grin of absolute terrifying power. He told me that Vanguard Sterling Equity was his subsidiary. The breath rushed out of my lungs in a sharp, stunned gasp. I stared at the man sitting across from me in his faded flannel shirt and scuffed work boots. Patricia had spent years mercilessly mocking him, calling him a dirty truck driver, treating him like he was entirely beneath her notice. Greg had refused to even shake his hand at Thanksgiving dinners, viewing him as an uneducated blue-collar worker who did not belong in their affluent world. They had absolutely no idea who they were actually dealing with. My mind raced, connecting the scattered dots with dizzying, exhilarating speed. Vanguard Sterling Equity was the sole investor for the $50 million warehouse project. That meant my father was the anonymous financial backer. He was the one holding the massive purse strings. He was effectively Greg's biggest investor, his silent partner, and his ultimate boss. The money that Patricia and Greg were desperately counting on to save them from federal prison belonged to the very man whose daughter they had just thrown out onto the street like garbage. My dad rested his hands flat on the oak table, his expression turning deadly serious. He told me that his corporate lawyers had been reviewing the final funding authorizations for Greg's warehouse project all week long. He explained that as the majority shareholder and head of the parent company, he had absolute unilateral authority to freeze, delay, or completely pull the funding at any given second for any reason he saw fit. He had the $50 million kill switch sitting right in the palm of his hand. I felt a surge of adrenaline so powerful it made my fingertips tingle warmly. I looked at my dad, visualizing the pristine black tie groundbreaking gala that Patricia and Greg were hosting right on the construction site this coming Friday evening. They were planning to invite the mayor, the local news anchors, and the entire city's financial elite to celebrate their massive success. They truly believed Friday was going to be their crowning social achievement and their ultimate financial salvation. I pulled my laptop closer to my eyes, locking firmly with my father's. I told him all about the gala. I explained that Patricia was going to stand up on a stage in front of every important person in Atlanta and pretend she was an untouchable real estate queen. I told him we could not just pull the funding quietly through a boring email from his lawyers. If we were going to end this, if we were going to make absolutely sure they could never hurt another innocent person or steal another dollar again, we had to do it where everyone could see. We had to tear down the arrogant facade they valued more than human life. My dad nodded slowly, the fierce, protective fire burning bright and dangerous in his eyes. He told me to go buy the most expensive, beautiful dress I could find. He said we were going to attend that groundbreaking gala together. He promised me that we were going to align our traps perfectly. While I dropped the forensic evidence of their massive embezzlement scheme right in their laps, he was going to stand on that stage and pull the $50 million rug right out from under their feet. We sat at the kitchen table, father and daughter, meticulously planning the absolute destruction of Oak Creek Holdings, ready to spring the ultimate trap at the exact same moment. Friday evening arrived with a heavy heat that settled over the city like a blanket. The sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the dirt and leveled concrete that would soon become the regional distribution hub. Patricia and Greg had spared no expense for the groundbreaking gala of their commercial warehouse park. They transformed an active construction site into a scene of astonishing luxury. A massive, clear-top event tent had been erected directly over the freshly poured foundation. Inside, enormous crystal chandeliers hung suspended from reinforced steel beams, catching the fading sunlight and throwing prisms across the space. The harsh reality of the bulldozers parked in the distance was completely masked by towering walls of imported white orchids and cascading green vines. Waitstaff in immaculate black uniforms circulated through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with glasses of vintage champagne and hors d'oeuvres. It was a strict black tie affair, the dress code heavily enforced by private security at the entrance. Patricia wanted the world to see her not as a desperate, cornered broker drowning in debt, but as a regal, untouchable titan of industry. This gala was intended to be their crowning social achievement. More importantly, it was supposed to be the glittering public distraction that perfectly masked their imminent financial salvation. They had invited the absolute pinnacle of Atlanta society to witness their triumph. The mayor was standing near the front of the stage, nodding eagerly along to an amusing story being told by a prominent local news anchor. Powerful city council members, rival developers, and the wealthiest private investors in the state were gathered under the clear canopy, clinking their expensive glasses and marveling at the sheer scale of the project. Patricia moved smoothly through the crowd like a queen holding court. She wore a stunning, floor-length silver gown that caught the chandelier light brilliantly with every step she took. Her smile was bright, radiating the total smug confidence of a woman who truly believed she had just won a devastating war. She genuinely thought the grave danger had completely passed. She believed that Arthur Vance and his temporary asset freeze were nothing more than a minor speed bump that she had successfully navigated around with her superior intellect. She was operating under the arrogant assumption that, because it was well after business hours on a Friday, the massive $50 million wire transfer from Vanguard Sterling Equity was already safely processing through the Federal Clearinghouse, completely untethered from her frozen domestic accounts. She thought the clean, legitimate cash was effectively hers, and that by Monday morning, she would be able to quietly replace the stolen client escrow funds before the state auditors even woke up to check their emails. She laughed loudly at a flattering joke made by a city commissioner, her manicured hand resting lightly on his tailored sleeve. She was putting on the absolute performance of a lifetime, entirely convinced of her own brilliance. Greg stood a few feet away from his mother, desperately trying to project the image of a masterful, commanding real estate tycoon. He wore a custom-tailored tuxedo that looked incredibly sharp, but I knew exactly how heavily he was sweating underneath that expensive black wool. He kept shifting his weight nervously from foot to foot, his eyes darting anxiously toward his smartphone every few minutes. He was waiting for the notification from the bank, the digital confirmation that the private equity funding had officially cleared and saved his life. Despite his deep panic over the frozen corporate cards and the brutal restaurant humiliation from earlier in the week, Greg was trying his hardest to play the part his mother demanded. He shook hands with wealthy contractors and smiled broadly for the local photographers who were roaming the event space to capture glossy images for the Sunday Society pages. Hovering just on the periphery of Greg's immediate social circle, standing carefully out of the main camera frames, was the 24-year-old leasing agent. She wore a sleek, incredibly expensive emerald green dress that hugged her frame perfectly, and she held a glass of champagne with a delicate, practiced elegance. Even from a distance, the light caught the unmistakable flash of the diamond tennis bracelet wrapped securely around her slender wrist. The very same bracelet that had been paid for with stolen client money just days before my birthday. She kept her distance, maintaining the professional facade of a junior employee attending a firm event, but her eyes constantly tracked Greg across the crowded room. Every so often, Greg would catch her gaze and offer a tight, secret smile, a silent promise that their lavish lifestyle was secure, and that the minor inconvenience of his declined credit cards was permanently resolved. He actually thought he was getting away with everything. He truly believed he was going to walk away from his marriage, steal his son, keep his young mistress, and become a multi-millionaire by the end of the night. The string quartet playing softly in the corner of the tent suddenly brought their classical music to a graceful close. The low murmur of the elite crowd hushed quickly as a sharp tone rang out over the audio system. Patricia was tapping a heavy silver spoon gently against the delicate side of her crystal champagne flute. She stepped up gracefully onto the raised velvet-covered stage at the front of the tent, moving confidently to the polished acrylic podium. She adjusted the microphone slightly, looking out over the vast sea of wealthy, influential faces staring back at her. She took a deep, theatrical breath, letting the silence stretch out to command the absolute, undivided attention of every single person in the room. Thank you all so much for joining us on this beautiful, momentous evening. Patricia began, her voice echoing richly through the massive event space. Her tone was incredibly smooth, dripping with practiced charm and an underlying current of overwhelming, undeniable arrogance. Tonight is not just about pouring concrete or raising steel walls. Tonight is about vision. It is about the unyielding, relentless drive to build something that will outlast us all. It is about family legacy. She paused dramatically, placing a hand over her heart, looking directly at the mayor sitting in the front row. When I started Oak Creek Holdings decades ago, I had a very clear vision for what this boutique firm could achieve. I wanted to create a financial institution built on absolute trust, unwavering integrity, and the sacred, unbreakable bond of family. And tonight, as we stand together on the foundation of the largest commercial development in this county's history, I can say with certainty that we have honored that vision perfectly. She gestured grandly toward Greg, motioning for him to step up onto the stage beside her. Greg puffed out his chest, adjusting his tuxedo jacket proudly as he climbed the short steps to stand right next to his mother. He looked out at the massive crowd, soaking in the warm applause that rippled eagerly through the tent. Patricia placed a loving maternal hand on his shoulder, presenting him to the city's financial elite. This warehouse project is the culmination of years of tireless, sleepless dedication, Patricia continued, her voice swelling with manufactured emotion. My son Greg has poured his absolute soul into this incredible development. He has shown the kind of true leadership and moral fortitude that makes a mother proud. We build our future. We build our future. The applause that followed her bold declaration was thunderous, filling the clear canopy and drifting out into the humid Georgia evening. People raised their champagne flutes, toasting to the brilliant illusion Patricia and Greg had so carefully constructed. That was the exact moment the heavy canvas flaps at the main entrance of the tent were swept aside by the event ushers. The sudden movement caught the attention of the guests lingering near the back, causing a ripple of murmurs that slowly traveled forward like a wave toward the stage. I stepped through the entrance, the heavy, humid air of the construction site giving way to the air-conditioned chill of the gala. I was not wearing the sensible flats or the modest clearance rack dresses Greg had always insisted we could barely afford. I was wearing a floor-length deep sapphire designer gown that draped perfectly across my shoulders and cascaded to the floor in a river of heavy, expensive silk. My hair was swept up in an elegant twist, and my posture was completely straight. I did not look like the terrified, blistered woman who had walked the highway just a few days prior. I looked like a woman who owned the room. Beside me walked my father. Gone was the faded flannel shirt and the scuffed work boots that Patricia so deeply despised. William was wearing a masterfully tailored midnight black tuxedo that fit his broad, imposing frame with absolute perfection. He looked every inch the self-made billionaire he truly was exuding. A quiet, gravitational power that instantly commanded the attention of the surrounding crowd. As we walked down the center aisle, the guests instinctively parted for us, their eyes darting between my stunning sapphire gown and my father's undeniable presence. The whispers grew louder, rolling across the room until they finally reached the stage. Patricia looked up, her triumphant smile freezing halfway across her face. The applause died away, replaced by a tense, confused silence. Greg squinted against the glare of the chandelier lights, his jaw dropping open in utter disbelief as he registered that the woman walking down the center aisle of his exclusive gala was the wife he had just served with eviction papers. Patricia gripped the edges of the acrylic podium, her knuckles turning a stark bone white. Her eyes darted frantically toward the private security guards positioned near the front rows. She leaned into the microphone, her voice vibrating with a sudden, vicious panic masked thinly as a joke for the elite crowd. "Excuse me," Patricia announced, the sound echoing sharply through the massive speakers. "It seems we have some lost wanderers. Will security please escort these individuals out? The catering staff enters through the back doors." A few uncomfortable chuckles rippled through the audience, but most guests remained completely silent, sensing the thick, dangerous tension radiating from the center aisle. Two large security guards in black suits stepped directly into our path, holding up their hands to block us from getting any closer to the stage. I felt a brief flutter of nerves, but my father did not even break his stride. He looked directly at the head of security, a man who clearly recognized the difference between a confused caterer and a man who possessed immense, undeniable authority. He simply stopped, locked eyes with the guard, and gave a slow, deliberate shake of his head. The guard hesitated, looking back at Patricia, completely unsure of how to handle the massive, well-dressed man who refused to be intimidated by a microphone announcement. Patricia's face flushed a deep, violent crimson. She leaned closer to the mic, abandoning the fake, charming tone entirely. "I said remove them immediately. They are trespassing on a private, closed construction site." My dad reached into the inner pocket of his tuxedo jacket and calmly withdrew a small, embossed silver card. He handed it to the security guard without saying a word. The guard glanced at the card, his eyes widening in sudden, panicked realization. He immediately took a large step backward, clearing the path and bowing his head slightly in a gesture of profound respect. Patricia watched her own security detail stand down, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to comprehend what was happening. Before Patricia could issue another frantic command, a man in a pristine gray suit stepped out from the front row of VIP seating and briskly climbed the short steps to the stage. This was Richard Sterling, the lead representative for Vanguard Sterling Equity. He was the man Patricia had been desperately corresponding with all week, the man holding the metaphorical keys to the $50 million private equity wire transfer that she needed to survive. Patricia instantly turned her attention to him, her panicked expression melting back into a facade of desperate, cloying relief. She reached out, gesturing for Richard to take the podium. She clearly believed he was stepping up to defend the project, to reassure the anxious crowd, and to finally praise Greg for his brilliant commercial vision. Richard stepped up to the acrylic podium, adjusting his silk tie. He did not look at Patricia, nor did he look at Greg. He looked out over the sea of wealthy investors, city officials, and local media representatives who were now hanging on his every word. Thank you, Patricia, Richard said, his voice carrying a crisp corporate authority that echoed loudly in the silent tent. Vanguard Sterling Equity has spent the last year carefully reviewing the financial architecture and development potential of this massive commercial warehouse project. We understand the vast amount of capital required to bring a vision like this from the drawing board to reality. Greg puffed out his chest again, a nervous, sweating smile creeping back onto his face. He looked out at the audience, ready to bask in the validation he so desperately craved. He thought the $50 million check was essentially in his pocket. Richard gripped the edges of the podium, his expression remaining entirely neutral. However, an investment of $50 million requires absolute, uncompromising oversight, he continued, his tone turning sharply serious. And major funding decisions of this incredible magnitude are never made by the representative board alone. They are made by the primary ownership. Patricia frowned, confusion warring with the blind arrogance on her face. Richard turned his body slightly, directing the attention of the entire room away from the stage and back down the center aisle. I am honored to introduce the man who actually holds the absolute authority over this project, Richard announced, his voice booming over the speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, please direct your attention to the true owner and majority shareholder of Vanguard Sterling Equity, Mr. William. The entire tent seemed to physically gasp in unison. Every head swiveled toward my father, who was standing tall and unbothered in his immaculate tuxedo. The mayor blinked in pure astonishment. I turned my eyes toward the stage to watch the exact moment my husband and mother-in-law realized they were staring at their own executioner. Patricia and Greg were completely paralyzed with shock. The color drained entirely from Greg's sweating face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. Patricia stood frozen at the podium, her mouth hanging open in a silent, jagged scream. The dirty truck driver she had mocked, the man she had barred from her pristine patio, was the anonymous billionaire holding their entire $50 million lifeline right in his hands. My father did not rush. He walked up the short set of velvet-covered steps with the slow, deliberate stride of a man who owned the very ground beneath his feet. The crowd parted for him in absolute breathless silence. You could hear a pin drop inside that massive clear tent. He reached the acrylic podium. Richard Sterling stepped aside, respectfully relinquishing his place and the microphone without a single word of protest. My father looked out over the sea of wealthy investors, city politicians, and local media. He did not look angry. He looked entirely in control. He adjusted the microphone, the sharp feedback echoing over the speakers, making Greg flinch visibly. "Thank you for the introduction, Richard," my father began. His deep, resonant voice filled the space entirely, replacing Patricia's frantic, high-pitched panic. Vanguard Sterling Equity has always prided itself on building communities, on supporting infrastructure, and on partnering with developers who share our core values of honesty and integrity. We deal in hard facts, intangible assets, and in absolute transparency. We do not do business with thieves. The word hung in the humid air like a physical strike. The mayor shifted uncomfortably in his front row seat. The news cameras, sensing the sudden shift from a boring corporate celebration to a major scandal, instantly raised their lenses. Red recording lights blinked on across the room. Patricia grabbed the edge of the podium, her knuckles white, desperately trying to yank the microphone away from my father. He simply blocked her advance with one broad shoulder, treating her frantic efforts like the buzzing of a mild annoyance. As of this exact moment, my father announced, his voice ringing with absolute crushing finality, "Vanguard Sterling Equity is officially and permanently pulling the $50 million funding commitment for this commercial warehouse project. The financing is terminated immediately." A collective, deafening gasp rippled through the elite crowd. Investors began murmuring frantically to one another. Reporters pushed forward, cameras clicking in rapid succession to capture the exact moment the biggest real estate deal in the city collapsed. Greg stumbled backward, his knees giving out slightly, forcing him to catch himself against a structural support beam. He looked like he was going to be physically sick, right there on the stage. "You cannot do this!" Patricia shrieked, her voice cracked, completely devoid of its previous elegant polish. "We have a signed contract. You are legally bound to provide that capital. I will sue you for everything you are worth." My father looked down at her. The cold, unyielding power in his eyes made her shrink back. "Our contract explicitly states that funding is contingent upon the maintaining of lawful business practices," he replied calmly, leaning into the microphone so the entire city could hear his next words. "We are terminating this agreement, citing severe, undeniable breach of contract and massive systemic financial fraud. Your firm is entirely insolvent, Patricia, and we will not use clean money to bail you out of a federal crime." He stepped back from the podium. The crowd erupted into total chaos. Investors were shouting questions. The local news anchors were speaking rapidly into their cameras, narrating the catastrophic public implosion of Oak Creek Holdings. Patricia and Greg scrambled down the stage steps, desperate to escape the blinding flash of the cameras. They retreated toward their designated VIP table at the edge of the dance floor, looking like terrified animals searching for a way out of a burning building. That was my cue. I walked forward, my sapphire gown gliding smoothly over the temporary flooring. I did not rush. I moved with the same deliberate, confident stride my father had just demonstrated. The crowd parted for me once again, sensing that the execution was not quite finished. I walked directly up to the VIP table, where Patricia was frantically dialing her phone, screaming at her legal team to answer. Greg was clutching his chest, hyperventilating as the reality of his absolute ruin crashed down upon him. I stopped right in front of them. I carried a thick, heavy manila folder in my right hand. The weight of it was substantial, filled with hundreds of pages of irrefutable condemning evidence. I lifted my hand and dropped the thick folder directly onto the center of their table. The heavy thud of the paper hitting the wood cut through the surrounding noise. Patricia dropped her phone. Greg stared at the folder, his eyes wide with terrified recognition. "What is this?" Patricia demanded, her voice a ragged, breathless rasp. I reached out and flipped the folder open. The top page was the executive summary of my forensic audit, detailing the exact, to-the-penny amounts of stolen client escrow funds. Right beneath that were the internal wire transfer receipts proving Greg had siphoned that stolen money to cover his failing commercial properties. I watched Patricia's eyes dart across the numbers. She recognized the routing data instantly. Her hands began to shake violently. I flipped to the next section. Glossy, high-resolution photographs spilled out across the white tablecloth. They were pictures of Greg and his 24-year-old leasing agent walking into the downtown boutique hotel on the Thursday afternoon. There were copies of the corporate credit card receipts, highlighting the expensive champagne, the executive suites, and the diamond tennis bracelet. Greg let out a strangled, pathetic sound. He looked across the room, desperately searching for his mistress. But the young leasing agent was not standing by the catering tables anymore. The second she had heard my father mention massive financial fraud and pulled funding, she had realized the money was gone. She had slipped out the back exit before the cameras even started flashing, vanishing into the night, and leaving Greg completely alone. "You broke into my servers," Patricia whispered, her eyes wide with a horrifying realization. "You stole my private financial records. This is illegal. I will have you arrested." I smiled at her, a cold, sharp expression that made her flinch. "You gave me the master administrative login, Patricia. You begged me to audit your firm for free because you were too cheap to pay a real accountant. You handed me the keys to your entire empire. All I did was look inside." Greg fell into a chair, putting his head in his hands. He was crying, actually sobbing, in front of the mayor, his investors, and the local press. "Lauren, please," he begged, his voice muffled by his hands. "Please, we can fix this. Just take the folder back. Do not show this to anyone else." I looked down at the man who had allowed his mother to leave his infant son stranded in the blistering heat. I looked at the woman who had mocked my father and threatened to render me homeless. The silence around our table was absolute. The reporters had pushed as close as security would allow, their microphones straining to pick up every single word of our confrontation. I sent copies to the Internal Revenue Service, the State Real Estate Commission, and the district attorney exactly an hour ago. I said, my voice ringing with total, unshakable clarity, into the stunned silence of the tent. They already have every single ledger, every wire transfer, and every piece of proof they need. Patricia let out a guttural, devastating cry. She collapsed into her chair, clutching her chest, as the absolute certainty of federal prison locked firmly into place. I leaned down, placing my hands on the table, bringing my face inches from Patricia's terrified eyes. "You told me I had zero value," I said softly, ensuring the microphone on the nearby camera caught the exact quote. "Let us see what your net worth is by tomorrow morning." I stood up straight, turning my back on their ruined lives. My father was waiting for me at the edge of the tent. He held out his arm, and I took it. We walked out of the gala together, leaving the flashing cameras and the crumbling remains of Oak Creek Holdings far behind us. The warm Georgia night air felt incredibly fresh, completely devoid of the toxic, suffocating pressure I had lived under for 2 years. We climbed into the back of his waiting car, the door shutting solidly against the noise of the panic inside the tent. The swift and brutal fall of Patricia's empire happened exactly as I had calculated. The very next Monday, long before the morning traffic had even cleared, a fleet of dark, unmarked vehicles pulled up to the glass-fronted corporate headquarters of Oak Creek Holdings. Dozens of federal agents flooded the building, seizing computer hard drives, filing cabinets, and servers. They carried boxes of evidence out through the front doors, in full view of the local news cameras that had been camped outside since Friday night's gala. Patricia lost her real estate broker's license instantly. The State Commission issued an emergency suspension before the sun even set. Facing overwhelming, undeniable digital evidence of multi-million-dollar escrow embezzlement and wire fraud, she was indicted within 3 days. She was staring down the barrel of a decade in federal prison, her pristine reputation reduced to a cautionary tale about greed and absolute arrogance. Greg's destruction was just as absolute, though far more pathetic. Entirely dependent on his mother's stolen wealth to prop up his failing deals, he went completely bankrupt by the end of the month. His commercial properties defaulted, seized by the very banks he had tried to defraud. His credit score plummeted to nothing. His 24-year-old mistress, the woman he had risked his entire family to impress, blocked his phone number the second his corporate cards were frozen, and was never seen again. 2 months later, we met for the final divorce mediation. We did not use Arthur Vance's luxurious downtown office. We met in a sterile, windowless conference room at the county courthouse. Greg sat across the table from me, looking pale, exhausted, and entirely defeated. He wore a cheap suit that hung loosely on his shrinking frame. He had no high-priced defense attorneys standing behind him. He could not afford them. He had a public defender who looked equally exhausted. Arthur Vance slid the final custody and settlement agreement across the polished wood table. It was not a negotiation. It was a surrender. Greg was completely destitute and facing potential criminal charges as a co-conspirator in his mother's fraud. To avoid me pursuing further civil damages that would financially ruin him for the rest of his natural life, he had to agree to my terms. Without saying a single word, Greg picked up the cheap plastic pen and signed his name on the dotted line. He surrendered full physical and legal custody of Leo to me. He walked out of the courthouse with absolutely nothing a ghost of the arrogant man he had once been. 1 year later, the harsh summer heat had given way to a crisp, beautiful autumn. I was sitting at the sprawling quartz kitchen island of my new home. It was a gorgeous 4-bedroom house in a quiet, highly secure neighborhood, and I had paid for the entire property in cash, using my offshore earnings. I was running my own highly successful forensic accounting firm now, managing a team of investigators who specialized in corporate fraud. I set my own hours, chose my own high-profile clients, and never had to ask anyone for permission to spend my own money. The front door chimed, and my dad walked in carrying a large cardboard box filled with toy trucks. He looked exactly the same, wearing his comfortable flannel shirt and scuffed boots, completely unbothered by the fact that he was one of the wealthiest men in the state. Leo, now an energetic 2-year-old, squealed with absolute delight and ran across the hardwood floor, throwing his arms around my dad's knees. My dad scooped him up, tossing him into the air and catching him with a booming laugh that filled the entire house with warmth. I smiled, pouring 2 mugs of hot, dark roast coffee. I carried them into the living room, setting them on the coffee table as my dad sat down on the sofa, with Leo on his lap. He reached for the remote control and turned on the television to catch the local evening news. The anchor's face appeared on the screen, detailing the major stories of the day. A familiar courthouse building flashed across the screen, followed by a brief, highly anticipated segment. Patricia was being led out of the federal courthouse in handcuffs. Her designer clothes were gone, replaced by a drab, standard-issue jumpsuit. Her face looked tired, aged, and completely devoid of her former arrogant superiority. The anchor announced that she had been officially sentenced to 8 years in federal prison without the possibility of early parole. My dad took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes fixed on the television screen. He looked over at me, a quiet, knowing satisfaction resting comfortably on his weathered features. I picked up my mug, letting the warm ceramic heat my hands. I looked at my beautiful, safe home. I looked at my thriving, happy son, playing safely in his grandfather's arms. I looked at the television screen one last time, watching the woman who had tried to break me being driven away in the back of a federal vehicle. I smiled a genuine expression of absolute peace. I picked up the remote control and turned off the television. I finally held complete, undeniable control over my own narrative, and my future was entirely my own. Financial abuse is insidious. It doesn't always start with empty bank accounts. Sometimes it begins under the guise of taking care of you or reducing your stress. Abusers like Greg and Patricia rely on isolation. They want you to forget your skills, your intelligence, and your capacity to survive without them. They build a cage of dependency and expect you to quietly accept your place inside it. But here is the truth. You are never as trapped as they want you to believe. Never lose your skills. Whether you are working full-time or taking a pause to raise a family, keep your mind sharp and your talents relevant. Build a safety net. Financial independence is the ultimate shield against manipulation and control. Recognize your true allies. Family isn't just about sharing a last name. It's about the people who will stand by you in the sweltering heat when you feel like you have nothing left. I learned that standing up for yourself isn't about throwing tantrums. It is about cold, calculated preparation and having the courage to walk away from toxic environments. You don't have to accept disrespect just because someone holds the purse strings. You have the power to write your own ending. Have you ever had to break free from a toxic relationship or stand up to someone who completely underestimated your worth? I want to hear your stories of taking back control. Drop a comment below and share how you found your strength. If my journey resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Let's keep building a community of strong, independent people who refuse to let anyone else dictate their value. Remember, you are always stronger than they think you are.